At my brother's lavish anniversary dinner, I stepped into the restroom to fix my lipstick. The catering manager brushed past me, pressing a damp cloth into my hand. Inside was a crumpled napkin. She leaned in and whispered, "Do not drink the champagne at the head table. The woman in the emerald dress just dropped crushed pills into your glass." I did not panic. I simply walked back out and seamlessly swapped my glass with hers. 30 minutes later, my entire family was stunned into silence because my stepmother became the main entertainment. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you know what it feels like to be the family scapegoat who finally decides to stop playing nice. Trust me, you will want to hear how I dismantled a 30-year illusion in a single night. My name is Zora and I am 35 years old. As a senior crisis management executive for a top-tier public relations firm, I make my living cleaning up other people's messes. I spin disasters into minor inconveniences. I read body language spot lies before they are spoken and anticipate catastrophes before they happen. But the hardest account I have ever had to manage is my own family. Tonight was supposed to be a milestone. We were gathered at the prestigious Oakmont Country Club, a sprawling estate of imported marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and crystal chandeliers to celebrate my older brother Trey and his wife Lauren. It was their 5th wedding anniversary. Trey is 33 and the undeniable golden child of the family. He is the son who could do no wrong, the heir apparent to our father's real estate development firm. Lauren, his fragile blonde wife with her perpetual innocent smile, plays the perfect supporting role. To the 200 elite guests dining on prime rib and roasted asparagus tonight, they looked like a magazine cover. To me, they looked like a massive financial liability. I sat at the head table sipping sparkling water and observing the room. My stepmother Vivian sat 2 seats away, radiating pure arrogance in a tailored emerald green silk gown. Vivian is 58 years old and married my father Calvin shortly after my biological mother passed away. For over 2 decades, Vivian has made it her personal mission to ensure I knew my exact place in the family hierarchy. In her eyes, I was the stubborn, independent daughter who refused to kiss the ring, while Trey was the compliant son who constantly validated her ego. She spent weeks micromanaging this anniversary party, throwing around my father's money to impress her high society friends. The towering floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and orchids alone probably cost more than a luxury car. But I knew the truth about where that money was coming from. I knew the family business was quietly bleeding dry. I kept my mouth shut, though, playing the dutiful daughter for my father's sake. His health had been declining rapidly over the last year, and he just wanted one peaceful evening surrounded by his friends. The dinner service was finally wrapping up and the crystal champagne flutes were being distributed for the grand toast. The waitstaff moved seamlessly through the room, pouring expensive vintage champagne. I noticed Vivian watching me. Her eyes darted from my empty dessert plate to the crystal flute being placed in front of me. She had a tight, forced smile on her face. I felt a sudden tightness in my chest, a familiar instinct warning me that something was terribly off. Vivian never smiled at me unless she was holding a knife behind her back. I excused myself from the table, picking up my leather clutch. I leaned over and told my father I needed to powder my nose before the formal speeches began. He nodded absent-mindedly, already captivated by Lauren, who was performing her usual routine of softly complimenting his tie and patting his arm. The country club restroom was a sanctuary of rose gold mirrors and smooth imported marble. It was completely empty save for the soft jazz playing through the hidden ceiling speakers. I walked over to the sink, gripping the cold edges of the marble counter, and took a deep breath. I just needed 5 minutes away from the suffocating pretense of my family. I pulled a tube of deep red lipstick from my clutch and leaned toward the brightly lit mirror. The heavy wooden door creaked open behind me. I watched in the reflection as a young black woman walked in. She wore the crisp black uniform of the catering staff, and her brass name tag read Aisha. She was carrying a stack of fresh rolled hand towels. I offered a polite smile and went back to applying my lipstick. But Aisha did not walk toward the supply closet. She walked directly toward me. Her eyes were wide, and she kept glancing nervously back at the closed wooden door. She stepped up to the sink next to mine, turning on the brass faucet to maximum pressure to mask the sound of her voice. She grabbed a fresh white towel and pressed it firmly into my hand. Her fingers were trembling slightly. I looked down and felt the rigid edges of a folded piece of paper hidden inside the thick cotton. I looked back up at her face. My PR instincts immediately kicked in. My heart rate steadied, my posture straightened, and my senses sharpened. Aisha leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss, I am so sorry to bother you," she said, her eyes locked on mine. "But you need to be careful. Do not drink the champagne at the head table. The older woman in the emerald dress, she dropped something into your glass." I stood perfectly still. The ambient jazz music seemed to fade into the background. I unfolded the paper hidden in the towel. It was a torn piece of a catering order form. Scrawled on the back in hurried handwriting were the words, "She crushed pills into the third glass on the left." I looked at Aisha. "Are you absolutely sure about what you saw?" I asked, keeping my tone completely level. I did not want to spook her. She nodded vigorously. "I was pouring the water service behind the velvet curtain," she whispered. I saw her take a small plastic bag from her silver clutch. She crushed 2 white pills with the bottom of her water goblet and brushed the powder right into your champagne flute when the waiter's back was turned. She stirred it with her finger. She looked around to make sure nobody saw, but I saw everything. I could not just let you drink it. A cold wave of absolute clarity washed over me. Vivian. Of course it was Vivian. Tomorrow morning, my father was hosting a private closed-door meeting with the estate lawyers to discuss the future of the company and my potential appointment to the board of directors. Vivian had been fighting my involvement for months. She needed me to look unstable. She needed me to cause a scene, to look erratic or intoxicated in front of the entire family and half of the city's elite. A heavy sedative combined with alcohol would do exactly that. It would ruin my professional credibility permanently and give her the ammunition she needed to lock me out of the estate. I looked at Aisha and saw the genuine fear in her eyes. She was risking her job, her livelihood, to warn a complete stranger. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and slid it smoothly into her apron pocket. "Thank you, Aisha," I said softly but firmly. "You have no idea how much you just helped me. Forget you saw anything tonight. I will handle it from here." I threw the paper into the trash bin and snapped my clutch shut. I looked at myself in the mirror one last time. My red lipstick was flawless. My posture was unbreakable. I was not the scared little girl Vivian used to lock out of the house anymore. I was a professional crisis manager, and my stepmother had just handed me the match to burn her entire carefully constructed world to the ground. I turned around, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and walked back out into the glittering ballroom, ready to rejoin the party. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, sealing away the quiet safety of the restroom. I stepped back into the grand ballroom, and the wall of sound hit me immediately. It was the specific hum of old money and deep debts. The room was a symphony of clinking silver crystal glasses, touching, and soft jazz floating from a grand piano in the corner. I moved through the sea of perfectly dressed guests with the posture of someone who owned the entire building. People nodded and offered polite smiles as I passed their tables. I returned the gestures without breaking my stride. In my line of work as a crisis manager, you learn quickly that confidence is an armor nobody tries to pierce. If you look like you are exactly where you belong, people will step out of your way and ask no questions. My eyes remained locked on the head table at the front of the room. Trey was standing behind Lauren's chair with his hands resting possessively on her bare shoulders, posing for a roving event photographer. Lauren was doing her signature fragile smile, the one that made her look like a delicate flower that needed constant protection. My father Calvin sat to their right, looking physically drained, but forcing a proud patriarch expression for the cameras. And then there was Vivian. She was watching my approach like a hawk tracking its prey. Her posture was rigidly perfect in that emerald silk gown. She looked like a woman who believed she held every single card in the deck. I slid back into my seat, keeping my face a mask of pleasant indifference. My crystal champagne flute sat exactly where I had left it, just to the right of my water goblet. It looked perfectly normal. Tiny golden bubbles rose steadily to the surface, catching the warm light of the chandeliers above. But I knew the poison was suspended in that liquid, waiting to humiliate me. Vivian shifted in her chair, leaning back slightly. I felt her gaze boring into the side of my head, waiting for me to take a sip. She wanted to watch me consume her trap so she could enjoy the downfall. The waiters finished their final rounds, pouring the last few drops of vintage champagne into the glasses of the extended family members sitting nearby. The timing had to be absolute perfection. I did not feel any fear. I did not feel the familiar childhood panic that usually accompanied Vivian's cruel games. That little girl who used to cry in her room when she was excluded from family dinners was completely gone. In her place was a woman who dismantled corporate scandals for breakfast. Swapping a glass of wine under pressure was nothing compared to bearing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit while smiling at a room full of reporters. I reached out and gently wrapped my fingers around the delicate stem of my flute. I saw Vivian exhale a tiny, shallow breath of anticipation out of the corner of my eye. I brought the glass halfway to my lips but stopped abruptly. I turned my head toward my father sitting 2 seats over. "Dad, you have a noticeable smudge of cigar ash on your left lapel," I said smoothly, pointing directly at his chest. I pitched my voice just loud enough for Vivian to hear over the ambient noise of the ballroom. My father frowned heavily and looked down immediately, brushing at the expensive fabric of his custom tuxedo jacket. Vivian instinctively turned her head to look at him, her obsession with perfect appearances overriding her intense focus on me. She could not stand the idea of a flawed photograph ruining her carefully curated image of a flawless, wealthy family. At that exact second, I let my heavy silk napkin slide off my lap and drop onto the floor. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I ducked down to grab it, and as my right hand scooped up the white fabric from the carpet, my left hand moved across the table with practiced fluid precision. I slid my tainted glass precisely onto Vivian's coaster and pulled her untouched glass directly in front of me. The base of the crystal did not even make a sound against the thick linen tablecloth. It took less than 2 seconds. By the time I sat back up, placing the napkin gracefully across my lap, the poisoned champagne was sitting directly in front of my stepmother. My new clean glass was waiting for me. Vivian turned back around completely oblivious. She had not noticed a single thing out of place. She had been too busy ensuring my father looked immaculate for the cameras. The event manager stepped up to the microphone stand at the center of the room and tapped it lightly, producing a soft thud that quickly silenced the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with a practiced smile, "please direct your attention to the head table for a toast from the father of the groom, Calvin." The grand ballroom quieted down until the only sound was the rustling of expensive fabrics as 200 guests turned in their seats to watch us. My father stood up, adjusting his tie with a slightly trembling hand. He raised his glass and looked down at Trey and Lauren. 5 years ago, he began, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. "I watched my son marry a woman who brought true grace and light into this family. Trey, you have grown into a man I am immensely proud to have running my development company. And Lauren, you are the daughter we always prayed for." I kept my face entirely blank. The daughter they always prayed for. It was a direct, calculated insult meant to remind me of my permanent status as the difficult outsider in my own bloodline. Tonight, however, the insult just sounded like a bad joke. I glanced over at Vivian. She was beaming, radiating a toxic maternal pride that usually made my stomach turn. She truly believed they had won. She believed the company was theirs, the legacy was theirs, and I was just minutes away from an embarrassing mental breakdown that would banish me from their lives forever. To family, my father concluded, raising his glass higher toward the ceiling, to loyalty to our legacy and to a prosperous future. To family, the entire room echoed in unison, raising their glasses toward the head table. I picked up my glass. Vivian picked up hers. We turned our heads to look directly at each other. She raised her flute toward me, with a subtle smirk that practically screamed checkmate. She wanted me to know she was in control of my destiny. I smiled back. It was a genuine, warm, terrifying smile that clearly unsettled her for a brief second. Her brow furrowed slightly, as if she could not understand why I looked so peaceful. "Cheers, Vivian," I said softly, my voice barely carrying over the music. I maintained direct, unbroken eye contact as I took a slow, deliberate sip of my clean champagne. Vivian quickly recovered her arrogant composure and mirrored my movement. She brought the tainted glass to her ruby-red lips and took a deep, generous swallow. I watched her throat work as the heavy liquid went down. She placed the crystal flute back on the table, looking incredibly satisfied with herself. She thought she had just secured her golden future. She thought she had successfully eliminated the only threat to her carefully built empire of lies. I set my glass down next to my dinner plate. The heavy lifting was officially done. Now all I had to do was sit back and wait for the chemistry to do its job. A heavy sedative mixed with vintage alcohol usually takes about 20 to 30 minutes to hit the human bloodstream properly. I picked up my silver fork and took a bite of my roasted asparagus. It tasted absolutely excellent. I looked around the room, watching the wealthy guests return to their animated conversations, completely unaware that a massive bomb was ticking away right at the head table. I felt no guilt. I felt absolutely no anxiety. I only felt the cold, calm certainty of someone who knew exactly how the story was going to end. 30 minutes passed in a blur of polite conversation and clinking silverware. The waitstaff quietly cleared the dessert plates, leaving only half-empty wine glasses and the remnants of forced laughter. I checked my gold wristwatch. Right on schedule. At the front of the room, the event manager handed a sleek silver microphone to Vivian. She took it with both hands, her emerald silk gown catching the light as she stepped up to the center of the head table. She looked like a queen preparing to address her loyal subjects. The ambient jazz music faded out and a hush fell over the 200 guests. Vivian tapped the microphone, her acrylic nails making a sharp clicking sound. She cleared her throat and smiled, a wide, practiced smile that reached exactly nowhere near her eyes. "Thank you," she began, her voice echoing crisply through the ballroom. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Trey and Lauren. Family is the most important thing in the world. It is the foundation of our legacy and the glue that holds our lives together." I took a slow sip of my water. She was hitting all the right notes. The dutiful matriarch holding the family together through thick and thin. My father looked up at her with pure adoration, completely blind to the snake coiling around his neck. For 20 years, Vivian continued, placing a hand elegantly over her heart. "I have devoted my life to this family. I have nurtured Trey into the incredible businessman he is today. And I have stood by my wonderful husband Calvin, ensuring our household remains a sanctuary of peace and unity. We have built an empire based on trust." That was when the first crack appeared. Vivian blinked rapidly, her eyelids suddenly looking incredibly heavy. She paused mid-sentence, swaying just a fraction of an inch to her left. She gripped the edge of the table with her free hand to steady herself. A few guests in the front row exchanged confused glances, but most assumed she was just overcome with emotion. "We have built," she started again, her tongue suddenly sounding thick and uncooperative. "We have built a very nice, very expensive sanctuary." Her voice had lost its crisp authority. It was dragging, slurring at the edges. Trey leaned forward in his chair, his golden child smile faltering slightly. "Mom?" he whispered loudly enough for me to hear. "Are you okay?" Vivian waved him off with a clumsy, erratic motion. "I am fine," she snapped into the microphone, the sudden aggression startling the room. "I am just saying we deserve all of this. I deserve it. I put up with so much ungrateful behavior for decades." She took a step forward, but her high heel caught the edge of the thick carpet. Her knee buckled under the sudden weight of the sedatives rushing through her central nervous system. She pitched sideways, her arms flailing as she tried to catch her balance. Her left hand slammed heavily into the massive center floral arrangement. The heavy crystal vase tipped over with a sickening crunch. Gallons of cold water and dozens of pristine white orchids spilled directly onto Lauren. Lauren shrieked, jumping up from her chair as the freezing water soaked her custom designer dress. The heavy vase rolled off the table and shattered against the marble floor, echoing like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. The crowd gasped in unison. My father jumped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Vivian, what is wrong with you?" he shouted, reaching out to grab her arm. But the drugs had completely dismantled her self-control and her sense of reality. She yanked her arm away from my father, nearly stumbling backward into the event backdrop. "Leave me alone, Calvin!" she slurred loudly. The microphone still clutched tightly in her hand, broadcasting every devastating word to the entire Oakmont Country Club. "You are always hovering, always asking questions about the money. I am sick of it." A collective murmur of shock rippled through the elite guests. These were city council members, real estate moguls, and wealthy socialites. They thrived on gossip, and Vivian was serving them a feast. "Mom, please put the mic down," Trey begged, rushing around the table. His face was flushed crimson with embarrassment. He reached for the silver microphone, but Vivian swatted him away with surprising force. "Get off me, Trey!" she yelled, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You do not tell me what to do. I pay your credit card bills, you little brat. If it was not for me moving the company funds into the offshore accounts, you and your fake crying wife would be living in a trailer park." The ballroom fell into a dead, horrified silence. The only sound was the faint dripping of water from the ruined floral arrangement falling onto the floor. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not blink. I did not react. I just watched the magnificent destruction of her own making. "What did you just say?" my father asked, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper. He stared at his wife as if he had never seen her before in his life. "You heard me," Vivian mumbled, swaying dangerously back and forth. Her eyes were half closed now, the heavy sedatives pulling her under. "I moved the money, Calvin. I had to. You are too weak to protect the assets from that ungrateful daughter of yours. Zora thinks she is so smart. But she is not getting a dime of the trust fund tomorrow. I made sure of it. I hid all the cash under Lauren's maiden name." Lauren let out a loud, dramatic sob, covering her face with her hands, but I could see the sheer panic radiating from her stiff posture. She had been named. The quiet embezzlement they had been running together was suddenly public knowledge broadcast over a sound system to 200 witnesses. Vivian laughed, a bizarre hollow sound that trailed off into a confused groan. She tried to take another step, but her legs finally gave out completely. She collapsed onto the floor in a heap of wrinkled emerald silk, the microphone dropping with a loud screech of feedback that made several guests cover their ears. She lay there muttering incoherently to herself about bank transfers and real estate deeds, while the country club manager frantically signaled for his staff to cut the audio. I slowly reached for my napkin and dabbed the corner of my mouth. It was the most honest speech she had ever given in her entire life, and she had delivered it right into my hands. The fallout was instantaneous. My father stood frozen in absolute shock, his chest heaving as he stared down at his incapacitated wife. Trey was frantically trying to pull Vivian up from the wet floor, but she was dead weight. Lauren was doing what she did best, playing the terrified victim, weeping loudly and asking someone to call a doctor, claiming Vivian was having a stroke. The wealthy guests were already leaning across their tables, whispering furiously to one another, their phones lighting up as they started texting the scandal to everyone who was not invited. I knew my cue. The trap had been sprung, the audience had seen the show, and now it was time for the blame to be shifted exactly as Vivian had originally planned, just with a completely different target. I pushed my chair back slowly, the wooden legs scraping softly against the floor, and stood up to face my family. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress. The scraping of my chair seemed to snap my father out of his frozen state. But instead of dropping to his knees to check his unconscious wife's pulse, he slowly turned his head to look at me. His face was a mask of pure defensive rage. It was a look I knew intimately. It was the exact same expression he wore when I was 16, and Vivian threw away my college applications, claiming they got lost in the mail. He had blamed me then for being irresponsible. And right now, standing over the wreckage of his marriage with 200 high society guests, watching his total humiliation, he was looking for his favorite scapegoat. "What did you do, Zora?" he demanded, his voice trembling with misdirected anger. He took a heavy step toward me, completely ignoring Vivian, who was groaning softly on the wet carpet behind him. "You did this. You came here tonight with your jealous, toxic energy, and you pushed her over the edge. She is having a severe panic attack because she knew you would sit there judging us like you always do." I looked at him in genuine disbelief. My stepmother had just publicly confessed into a live microphone to embezzling corporate funds and laundering them through his daughter-in-law's maiden name. But in Calvin's twisted reality, the problem was not the massive financial theft. The problem was my aura. He was so desperate to protect the fake image of his perfect household that he was willing to rewrite history right in front of a room full of witnesses. Before I could even process the sheer magnitude of his delusion, Trey was suddenly right in front of me. He abandoned his mother on the floor and marched around the long table, his face flushed an ugly shade of crimson. He raised his hand and shoved his index finger right into my face, stopping barely an inch from my nose. "You are sick," Trey spat saliva flying from his mouth. "You are entirely sick in the head. You could not just let me have one night, could you? One night to celebrate my marriage and my success. But no, you have to sit there radiating bitterness because your own life is completely empty." I did not step back. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked entirely on his. "You are 35 and completely alone," Trey continued, his voice rising in pitch so the surrounding tables could hear him clearly. "You have no husband, no family of your own, and no real power. You are just a glorified party planner pretending to be a corporate executive. You hate that I am running the company. You hate that Dad chose me to inherit the legacy. And you hate Lauren because she is everything you will never be. She is kind and she is loved. You just wanted to ruin my anniversary because you are a bitter, lonely woman who cannot stand to see anyone else happy." I let the words breathe. I let the audience feel the full weight of his staggering entitlement. Trey had spent his entire life being handed every single opportunity on a silver platter. Dad bought him his business degrees, bought him his executive title, and funded his luxury lifestyle. Trey had never worked a hard day in his 33 years on Earth. His entire existence was subsidized by my father's blind loyalty. Yet here he was, standing in a bespoke tuxedo, paid for by the family trust, accusing me of being jealous of his hollow, fabricated life. He expected me to crumble. He expected my eyes to fill with tears. He expected me to lower my head, grab my leather clutch, and run out of the ballroom in shame, just like I used to do when we were teenagers, and he would humiliate me in front of his friends. My father stood right behind him, nodding in stern agreement, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting for me to surrender. I looked at Trey's shaking finger. I looked at my father's disappointed scowl. I looked past them at Lauren, who was still pretending to cry into a white linen napkin while desperately avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. And then I laughed. It did not start as a polite chuckle. It started deep in my chest and erupted out of me raw and unrestrained. I threw my head back and laughed right in my brother's flushed face. The sound echoed loudly across the silent ballroom, cutting through the thick tension like a shattered window. It was not a hysterical or panicked laugh. It was the genuine, uncontrollable laughter of a woman who was watching a spectacular comedy show that only she understood the punchline to. Trey's face dropped instantly. The sheer confidence of his attack dissolved, replaced by total confusion. He lowered his finger, taking a half step backward. "What is wrong with you?" he stammered, looking around the room as if asking the wealthy guests to validate his confusion. Mom is on the floor having a medical emergency, and you are laughing like a psychopath. I stopped laughing, but the wide, bright smile remained fixed on my face. I looked Trey slowly up and down, taking in his expensive suit and his terrified, insecure eyes. She is not having a medical emergency. Trey. I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly clear. She is high on the heavy sedatives she tried to slip into my champagne 20 minutes ago. But do not worry, her vital signs should be completely stable while she sleeps off her failed felony attempt. My father took a sharp, breathless step forward. How dare you make such a psychotic accusation, he hissed, leaning over the table. You are leaving right now. I will not let you stand here and slander my wife while she is vulnerable. You are done, Zora. Get out of this venue before I have you physically removed. I did not flinch. The threat of being removed from the family, the threat of being cast out into the cold, was the only weapon Calvin had ever successfully wielded against me. He used it to keep me in line, to force me to apologize to Vivian, to make me swallow my pride so his house could remain quiet. But he was firing blanks tonight. He just did not realize his gun was empty yet. The guests at the nearest tables were completely still, their expensive dinners growing cold on their porcelain plates. I could see the city mayor sitting 2 tables away, watching the exchange with wide eyes, his silver fork suspended halfway to his mouth. The country club staff had frozen in their tracks, unsure if they should intervene or pretend they were invisible. You are projecting, Dad, I said smoothly, resting my hands on the edge of the damp tablecloth. You are so desperate to keep the illusion of your perfect life intact that you are willing to ignore the fact that your wife just admitted to robbing you blind. You would rather scream at me than look at the bank statements. That is not toxic energy on my part. That is just pathetic cowardice on yours. Trey slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the remaining crystal glassware. You do not talk to him like that, he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. He is the CEO of a multi-million-dollar firm, and you are just an ungrateful guest. Lauren, go get the manager right now. Tell them we need security to escort an abusive guest off the premises immediately. Lauren sniffled loudly, dabbing her dry eyes with the corner of her ruined dress. She nodded quickly, eager for any excuse to step away from the epicenter of the disaster she had helped create. She turned and began waving frantically toward the back of the room, where the country club manager was standing near the double doors. I watched Lauren play her favorite role, the delicate victim seeking rescue from the angry, intimidating black woman. It was a dynamic she had weaponized against me since the day Trey brought her home to meet the family. Whenever I questioned her suspicious expenses or asked why she needed a company credit card for personal vacations, she would start crying and tell Trey I was bullying her. And Trey, playing the valiant savior, would always rush to her defense, demanding I apologize for making his wife uncomfortable. But tonight, there would be no apologies. Tonight, the entire power dynamic of this family was about to be permanently inverted. Let them call security. Let them try to throw me out into the street. I wanted them to overplay their hand. I wanted them to feel the absolute peak of their unearned authority before I ripped the floorboards out from underneath them. Lauren did not miss a beat. As soon as Trey demanded security, she shifted her performance into high gear. Her shoulders began to heave and she pressed her white linen napkin against her eyes, letting out a series of ragged, theatrical sobs. It was a masterclass in weaponized fragility. I stood there and watched her with the clinical detachment of a PR professional analyzing a rival campaign. She knew exactly what she was doing. In a room full of wealthy, predominantly white country club members, the image of a delicate, weeping blonde woman being allegedly terrorized by a calm, unsmiling black woman was a narrative that sold itself. She waved frantically toward the back of the ballroom, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light. "Mr. Sterling, please," she cried out, her voice trembling perfectly. "We need help over here immediately." The club manager, a tall, sharply dressed man in a tailored charcoal suit, hurried across the marble floor. 2 burly security guards in dark blazers followed closely behind him. The atmosphere in the room shifted from shocked whispers to tense anticipation. The guests were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable moment where the disruptive element was forcibly removed so their polite society could return to normal. Mr. Sterling arrived at our table out of breath. He looked down at Vivian, who was still snoring softly on the wet carpet, and then looked up at my family. Trey immediately stepped in front of Lauren, puffing out his chest to play the valiant protector. "We need her removed right now," Trey ordered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She poisoned my mother, and now she is verbally attacking my wife. She is completely out of control." Lauren peeked out from behind her napkin, her eyes wide and pleading. "She is scaring us, Mr. Sterling," Lauren said, her voice cracking with manufactured terror. "She has been screaming at us and making violent threats. I do not feel safe with her here. Please, you have to get her away from us." I did not roll my eyes. I did not raise my voice. I simply observed the specific words she chose to use. Scaring us. Violent threats. Does not feel safe. These were not accidental phrases. They were carefully selected, racially coded triggers designed to activate a protective instinct in the men around her and cast me as an inherent physical danger. It was the exact same playbook she had been running for 5 years. Whenever I asked to see the receipts for her company-funded luxury spa trips, she would cry to Trey that I was intimidating her. Whenever I pointed out the glaring discrepancies in the payroll accounts she managed for my father's firm, she would hyperventilate and claim my aggressive tone was triggering her anxiety. Her tears were a bulletproof shield she used to deflect any accountability, and my father and brother were always eager to jump in front of the bullets. They were so desperate to feel like strong providers that they willingly blinded themselves to the fact that the damsel in distress was actively robbing them blind. My father stepped up next to Trey, his face dark with fury. "You heard my daughter-in-law," he told the manager, his voice booming with the arrogant authority of a man who was used to giving orders. "This woman is harassing my family. I want her escorted off the property immediately, and if she resists, I want you to call the police." The guests at the nearby tables were watching me with a mixture of pity and judgment. They fully expected me to lose my temper. They expected me to start shouting, to wave my hands, to validate every single stereotype Lauren was trying to pin on me. They wanted the angry black woman narrative because it was easy and comfortable to digest. It would allow them to go back to their expensive dinners with a clear conscience, knowing the villain had been vanquished. But I was not going to give them that satisfaction. I remained perfectly still, my posture straight and relaxed. I looked at Lauren, who was peeking at me through her fingers, waiting for my explosive reaction. She needed me to blow up. She needed the distraction. If everyone was focused on my anger, nobody would ask questions about what Vivian had mumbled into the microphone regarding the offshore bank accounts under Lauren's maiden name. Lauren's tears were not just a defense mechanism tonight. They were a desperate smokescreen to hide her massive financial crimes. I smiled warmly at her. It was the kind of smile that promised absolute ruin. The security guards took a step forward, their hands resting on their radios. The tension in the ballroom was so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Trey glared at me, triumphant and self-assured. He truly believed he had won. He believed that his status as the golden child, paired with his wife's weaponized tears, gave him the ultimate authority to erase me from the narrative. He thought he could just snap his fingers and make me disappear. Mr. Sterling stood between me and my furious family. He looked at Trey, who was red-faced and sweating. He looked at Lauren, who was whimpering loudly into her napkin. He looked at my father, who was gesturing angrily toward the exit doors. And then the manager turned around and looked directly at me. I did not break eye contact with Lauren. I wanted her to see the exact moment her entire world collapsed. I wanted her to feel the ground open up and swallow her whole. Mr. Sterling, the manager, cleared his throat. He did not signal the security guards. He did not reach for my arm. He did not ask me to leave. Instead, he straightened his posture, clasped his hands politely in front of him, and waited for my instructions. The silence that followed was deafening. The entire room seemed to freeze. Trey lowered his arm, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Lauren stopped sobbing, her napkin dropping slightly, to reveal a face completely devoid of tears. My father opened his mouth to shout another order, but the words died in his throat. They could not comprehend what was happening. They had played their ultimate trump card, and the dealer had simply refused to accept it. Mr. Sterling gave me a brief, respectful nod. He was a professional who understood exactly who signed his paychecks. He ignored my screaming family entirely and addressed me with the quiet deference reserved for true authority. It was the perfect setup. The stage was set, the audience was captivated, and the villains had voluntarily painted themselves into a corner with their own arrogance. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the crisp air of the ballroom, and prepared to drop the anvil. The manager kept his hands clasped neatly in front of him. He did not look at my father, who was practically vibrating with rage. He did not look at Lauren, who was still holding the damp napkin near her face. He looked directly into my eyes and lowered his head in a slight bow. "Are you experiencing any issues this evening, Ms. Zora?" he asked, his voice calm and entirely professional. "Would you like me to have security clear the immediate area around your table?" The sound of Lauren's sharp intake of breath was loud enough to be heard over the distant piano music. Her hand slowly lowered, revealing a face completely drained of color. She looked back and forth between me and the manager, as if trying to translate a foreign language. Trey stepped forward violently, bumping the edge of the table. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, pointing his finger directly at the manager's chest. "I just told you this woman is harassing my wife. She poisoned my mother. I demand you remove her from this property immediately, or I will personally see to it that you lose your job." Mr. Sterling did not even blink. He smoothly adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and looked at my brother with a mixture of pity and polite disdain. "I am afraid I take my employment directives directly from the owner, sir," the manager replied. "And she has not asked me to leave." My father let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "The owner," he scoffed, stepping up beside Trey to present a united front of masculine authority. "I have been a platinum member of the Oakmont Country Club for 15 years. I know the owner. Richard Vance is a personal friend of mine. I played golf with him last month. You are making a massive mistake, young man. I paid $50,000 to rent this grand ballroom tonight. I am the client, and I am telling you to throw my ungrateful daughter out onto the street." I rested my fingertips lightly on the edge of the damp tablecloth. The moment had finally arrived. The carefully constructed illusion they had lived in for decades was about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "Actually, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy tension like a perfectly sharpened blade, "Richard Vance is not the owner anymore." My father stopped talking. He stared at me, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Richard Vance filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy, 9 months ago." I continued, speaking slowly and clearly, so every single word registered in his mind. "He made some terrible investments in commercial real estate and over-leveraged the club. The board of directors kept it extremely quiet to prevent a mass exodus of the elite membership. They needed a private buyer with massive liquid capital to step in, assume the debts, and save the property from being auctioned off by the banks." I watched the blood slowly drain from my father's face as the gears in his head began to turn. He looked around the magnificent ballroom, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the imported marble floors, and the towering floral arrangements. 6 months ago, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step out from behind the table, my primary holding firm purchased the Oakmont Country Club in its entirety. I own the golf course. I own the tennis courts. I own the grand ballroom you are standing in. And I own the chair you are currently gripping to keep yourself from falling over." Trey let out a loud, forced laugh, shaking his head in aggressive denial. "You are lying," he spat, his voice echoing across the silent room. "You are completely delusional, Zora. You do not have the kind of money to buy a place like this. You are just a PR girl. You work for a salary. You are making this up to save face because you know you are about to be dragged out of here in handcuffs." I looked at Mr. Sterling and gave him a tiny, barely perceptible nod. The manager reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, leather-bound tablet. He tapped the screen twice and held it out toward my brother. Sir Mr. Sterling said, his voice dripping with icy professional courtesy. "You are currently trespassing on private property owned by Zenith Holdings. Ms. Zora is the sole proprietor and chief executive officer of that firm. If you would like to dispute the legal deed, I can have security escort you to the administrative office. Otherwise, I suggest you lower your voice." Trey stared at the bright screen of the tablet. His eyes darted back and forth across the legal text, his lips parting in silent shock. He looked like a man who had just stepped out of an airplane, only to realize he forgot to wear a parachute. He stumbled backward, bumping into Lauren, who was now staring at me with genuine, unadulterated terror. The fake tears were completely gone. The fragile victim act had vanished. She finally realized that the angry black woman she had been trying to weaponize the staff against was actually the person who signed their paychecks. My father looked physically ill. He placed his hand over his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. "You own the club," he whispered the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "How? How is that even possible? You never asked me for a loan. You never asked the family for investment capital." "I did not need your money, Dad," I replied, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. "I built my own wealth while you were busy pouring every cent of the family trust into Trey's failing projects. I spent the last 10 years cleaning up corporate disasters for billionaires. Did you really think I was just fetching coffee? They pay me incredibly well to be the smartest person in the room. And right now you are standing in my house, drinking my champagne and shouting at my staff." The surrounding guests were dead silent. The elite socialites, the city officials, the wealthy business owners who had been judging me just 5 minutes ago were now staring at me with a mixture of awe and absolute respect. In their world, money was the ultimate equalizer, and I had just proven that I held the keys to the castle. I looked down at Vivian, who was still sprawled out on the wet carpet. Her emerald gown ruined her mouth, hanging open, as she snored softly through her drug-induced stupor. She had planned this entire evening to be my public execution. She had orchestrated the seating chart, the speeches, and the poisoned champagne just to prove that I was nothing. I stepped over Vivian's unconscious legs and walked directly up to Lauren. She shrank back, trembling slightly, as I invaded her personal space. I leaned in close, lowering my voice so only she and Trey could hear me. "You wanted security, Lauren," I asked softly. "You wanted to play the terrified victim. Well, you are about to find out what it actually feels like to be afraid. Because I am not just the owner of this club. I am the woman who has been quietly auditing your life for the past 6 months." I turned away from her terrified face and walked back to my seat. I sat down gracefully, smoothing my dress, and picked up my clean glass of champagne. "Mr. Sterling," I said, raising my voice just enough to carry over the silent crowd, "please do not call the police just yet. My family and I have a few more matters to discuss before the authorities arrive to collect my stepmother." The manager bowed his head respectfully and stepped back, signaling the security guards to stand down but remain close. I looked at my father and my brother. They were completely paralyzed, stripped of their unearned authority, and trapped in a cage of their own making. The warm-up act was officially over. It was time to pull out the financial records and show them exactly how deep the grave they had dug for themselves truly was. The absolute silence that swept over our table was heavy enough to crush bone. For a family that communicated exclusively through shouting matches and passive-aggressive insults, they had suddenly lost their ability to speak entirely. The ambient noise of the grand ballroom had also dropped to a hushed murmur. 200 of the most influential people in the city were pretending to look at their phones or sip their drinks, but every single ear was dialed directly into our table. Mr. Sterling and the security team took 2 synchronized steps backward, giving me the floor, but remaining close enough to enforce my authority. My father stood frozen, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He looked around the room, taking in the opulent surroundings, the crystal chandeliers, the gilded moldings, and the imported marble, as if he was seeing them for the very first time. He had walked into this building tonight, believing he was the king of his domain, graciously allowing his difficult daughter to sit at his royal table. Now he was realizing he was just a guest in my kingdom. He slowly brought his gaze back to me. The anger that usually masked his insecurities was entirely gone, replaced by a frantic, desperate need to reassert his dominance. "This does not make any sense," Calvin said, his voice shaking. He placed both hands firmly on the table, leaning toward me as if trying to physically intimidate me into changing the truth. "You are a PR girl, Zora. You fix reputations for a living. You do not have the liquid capital to acquire commercial real estate of this magnitude. My development firm has been the premier real estate company in this city for 30 years. I know exactly what this property is worth. I know the kind of capital Richard Vance was demanding. There is absolutely no way you could afford this. You are lying to me." I looked at the man who had spent my entire life underestimating me. He had always viewed my career as a cute little hobby, a distraction until I eventually settled down and found a husband to take care of me. He never bothered to ask what I actually did when I flew to London or Dubai for emergency client meetings. He just assumed I was answering phones and writing press releases. I reached down and picked up my black leather tote bag from the empty chair beside me. I set it on my lap and unzipped the main compartment. "I do not write press releases, Dad," I said, my voice completely level and devoid of emotion. "I restructure corporate entities that are on the verge of total collapse. I walk into boardrooms full of panicked billionaires, and I tell them exactly which limbs they need to amputate to save the patient. They pay me exorbitant amounts of money for my discretion and my strategy. I took those exorbitant amounts of money and I started my own private equity firm 5 years ago." I pulled a thick black folder from my bag. It was heavy, packed with over 100 pages of legally binding financial documents. I held it in my hands for a brief moment, feeling the weight of their ruin. "While you were busy buying Trey a new Porsche every time he closed a minor deal, I was quietly buying up distressed assets across the East Coast." I continued. "I did not need your permission, Dad. I did not need your approval, and I certainly did not need your money, because quite frankly, you do not have any money left to give." I tossed the black folder onto the table. It landed with a heavy, solid thud, sliding precisely across the dry section of the linen cloth, stopping inches from my father's hands. Calvin stared at the black folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Trey, who had been standing slightly behind Lauren, suddenly stepped forward, his eyes locked on the leather binding. The arrogant smirk he had worn all evening was completely wiped from his face. "What is that?" Trey asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That is the reality you have been hiding from for the last 3 years," I said, gesturing smoothly toward the folder. "Open it." My father hesitated. For a man who built his entire identity on control, he was visibly terrified of a stack of paper. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out and flipped open the heavy black cover. The first page was a summary sheet printed in stark black and red ink. I had my accountants prepare it specifically for this exact moment. It was a complete, unfiltered dossier of the family business. It detailed every catastrophic failure, every hidden debt, and every reckless gamble they had taken to maintain their wealthy facade. Calvin began to read. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His eyes darted back and forth across the columns of numbers, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. "Let me save you the trouble of doing the math," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. "Your premier real estate company is drowning in over $14 million of toxic debt. You have defaulted on 3 major commercial loans in the last 8 months. The luxury condominium project Trey convinced you to break ground on last year is a complete disaster. He mismanaged the zoning permits, overpaid the contractors, and hemorrhaged cash until the banks froze your primary credit lines." Trey flinched violently as I laid his incompetence bare for everyone to hear. "Shut up, Zora," he hissed, glancing nervously around the room. "You do not know what you are talking about. Every business has debt. It is called leveraging assets. We are just dealing with a temporary cash flow issue." I let out a soft, sharp laugh. "Leveraging assets is when you have actual capital to back up the loans, Trey. What you have is a house of cards sitting in a hurricane. You have been moving money from one failing project to cover the interest payments of another. It is a textbook Ponzi structure, and the only reason the federal government has not audited you yet is because you have been cooking the books. My father flipped to the next page, his hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. He was looking at the internal payroll accounts, the accounts that Trey was supposed to be managing as the heir apparent to the company. Where did this money go? Calvin croaked, pointing a trembling finger at a long list of red deductions. These figures do not make any sense. We had a $2 million reserve fund for the downtown plaza renovation. This says the account is completely empty. Where did it go, Trey? Trey swallowed hard sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. He tugged nervously at the collar of his expensive custom tuxedo. Dad, I can explain that, he stammered, taking a step back as Calvin glared at him. We had some unexpected overhead costs. The materials for the plaza were delayed, and I had to pay premium rush fees to the suppliers. It is all accounted for, I swear. It is absolutely accounted for. I interrupted, my voice cutting through Trey's pathetic lies. Just not by the suppliers. It is all right there on page 4, Dad. Turn the page. Calvin frantically flipped the heavy paper over. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he scanned the detailed bank statements I had legally subpoenaed through my holding company when we began acquiring their debt. The reality of his blind faith in his golden child was staring him right in the face. You gave him the keys to your legacy, Dad, I said quietly. You handed the company over to a boy who cares more about his country club membership and his designer watches than he does about profit margins. You chose him because he stroked your ego, and you pushed me out because I told you the truth. And now your legacy is completely worthless. Calvin gripped the edges of the folder, his knuckles turning white. He was breathing heavily, the reality of his total financial ruin crashing down on him all at once. He had spent his entire life building an empire only to watch his entitled son burn it to the ground to keep warm. But the debt was only the first layer of the nightmare I had prepared for them. The empty corporate accounts were just the warm-up. Because the business was not the only thing Calvin had sacrificed to keep up appearances. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and it was time to bring that betrayal into the light. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and tapped the thick black folder with my index finger. Turn to page 9. Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady pitch that carried a very different kind of weight. The corporate debt is just business. Your total failure as a CEO is a matter of public record now, and the banks will deal with that tomorrow morning. But page 9 is where this becomes completely unforgivable. Calvin's hands were visibly shaking now. The arrogant patriarch who had demanded my removal from the property just minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a landmine. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the heavy paper. He knew exactly what was on page 9. He had been hiding it from the entire world, praying the secret would stay buried in the vault of his corrupt bank manager. Turn the page, Calvin Y demanded, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. He slowly flipped to the document. As soon as his eyes registered the stark legal header printed at the top of the page, he let out a sharp, ragged gasp. He dropped the folder entirely, as if the paper had physically burned his hands. He sank back into his chair, pressing his palms against his eyes, trying to block out the reality staring back at him. Trey lunged forward, grabbing the folder from his father. He stared at the page, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal jargon. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "This is a deed transfer. Dad, what is this?" I did not let my father answer. I wanted the words to come from me. I wanted everyone in that glittering ballroom to understand exactly what kind of man they had been drinking with. "That is a notice of a secondary massive mortgage line," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "Taken out against the property on Maple Drive." Trey froze, his mouth hanging open. Lauren, who had been slowly edging away from the table, stopped dead in her tracks. Even Vivian, who was still incapacitated on the floor, let out a soft groan, as if the sheer weight of the betrayal had managed to penetrate her drug-induced haze. The house on Maple Drive was not just a piece of real estate. It was not a disposable asset to be tossed around in a game of corporate monopoly. That house was my biological mother's heart and soul. She bought that plot of land when she was 25 years old, working double shifts as a registered nurse. She hired the contractors, she picked the brick, she laid the hardwood floors herself to save money. For a black woman in her generation, building a custom home in that neighborhood was an act of profound defiance and supreme triumph. It was her sanctuary. Before she passed away, she made my father swear on her hospital bed that the house would remain entirely unencumbered. It was meant to be heir property. It was supposed to be the anchor of our generational wealth, a permanent safe haven that no bank could ever touch. It was the only tangible piece of her I had left in the world, and my father sold it out from under me. 6 months ago, I continued, my gaze locked intensely on Calvin's face. When the banks finally cut off your credit lines, you were faced with a choice. You could have forced Trey to sell his luxury cars. You could have downgraded your lifestyle. You could have admitted that the business was failing and restructured your debts like a responsible adult. But you were too weak for that. You could not stomach the idea of looking like a failure to your country club friends. So you quietly went behind my back, forged the necessary estate documents, and leveraged my mother's ancestral home to the absolute maximum limit. Calvin slowly lowered his hands from his face. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, soaking into the collar of his expensive custom tuxedo. Zora, please, he whispered, his voice cracking with shame. I had no choice. It was a bridge loan. I was going to pay it back as soon as the downtown plaza project closed. I just needed temporary liquidity to keep the company afloat. I slammed my hand down on the table. The sharp crack made both Trey and Lauren jump backward. You did not need liquidity to keep the company afloat, I snapped, the cold professional veneer finally giving way to raw, furious, righteous anger. You needed liquidity to keep your golden child in custom suits. Look at the itemized withdrawals, Dad. Look at where the money from my mother's house actually went. I pointed a sharp, manicured finger at Trey, who was staring at the paper in absolute horror. $200,000 was transferred directly to Trey's personal accounts to cover his massive gambling debts from his trips to Vegas. Another $100,000 went to paying off the arrears on Lauren's diamond jewelry. And the icing on the cake, the absolute peak of your staggering disrespect, is this very party. I gestured broadly around the grand ballroom, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the towering white orchids, and the imported vintage champagne. This entire anniversary party, I said, my voice ringing with absolute disgust. The $50,000 venue fee, the prime rib, the custom dresses. It was all paid for with the equity from my mother's house. You literally mortgaged a dead black woman's legacy, so your incompetent son and his fake wife could play pretend for an audience of strangers. You traded the bricks my mother laid with her bare hands for a single night of applause. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The wealthy guests who had been whispering a few moments ago were entirely, completely silent. The sheer magnitude of the cultural and familial betrayal was too dark to gossip about. It was a tragedy unfolding in real time. For a man to risk the ancestral foundation of his family just to spoil a grown child was the ultimate disgrace. Trey looked at his father, his eyes wide with disbelief. You mortgaged the house? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dad, you told me the business had a surplus. You told me the company paid for the anniversary. Calvin could not even look his son in the eye. He stared down at his ruined dinner plate, his shoulders completely slumped. Because he is a coward, Trey. I said, stepping around the table until I was standing directly in front of my brother. He would rather steal from his dead wife than tell you no. He has spent 33 years protecting you from the consequences of your own actions. He built a beautiful golden pedestal for you, and he destroyed my mother's legacy to pay for it. I leaned in close so only Trey and my father could hear my next words. But the tragic irony is that it was all for absolutely nothing. Because you defaulted on that mortgage too. The bank called the loan 3 weeks ago. My father was legally served with the foreclosure papers on Tuesday. He just did not have the guts to tell you. Calvin let out a choked sob, burying his face in his hands. Trey staggered backward, completely paralyzed by the realization that his entire life, his wealth, his status, his marriage was completely built on stolen rotting wood. He had nothing. He was nothing. But I was not finished. I had dismantled the father, and I had broken the golden child. Now it was time to turn my attention to the sweet, innocent daughter-in-law, who had been quietly accelerating their demise from the shadows. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with Lauren. I stared at Lauren, watching the sheer panic radiate from her perfectly contoured face. She knew her turn was coming. She took a shaky breath, preparing to launch into another pathetic performance of white tears to save her own skin. But before she could even open her mouth, a sharp scraping sound interrupted us. Down on the wet carpet, Vivian was finally starting to claw her way back to consciousness. The heavy sedatives she had consumed were still actively fighting her central nervous system, but her sheer malicious willpower and toxic greed were momentarily winning the battle. She blindly reached up, grabbing the edge of the linen tablecloth to pull herself off the floor. Her emerald silk gown was completely ruined, dark with spilled water, and stained from the marble floor. Her immaculate updo had collapsed, leaving wet strands of hair plastered against her face. She looked absolutely unhinged. She swayed heavily on her feet, clutching the edge of the table to keep from collapsing again. Her eyes were bloodshot and glassy, but as they locked onto me, they filled with a venomous, hateful clarity. She had drifted in and out of her stupor just enough to hear the end of my conversation with my father. She heard the words mortgage and foreclosure and the house on Maple Drive. And in her deeply entitled mind, those words were a direct threat to her royal treasury. "You are lying!" Vivian slurred her voice, a harsh guttural screech that made several guests at the adjacent tables physically flinch. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at my face. "You are a dirty lying snake, Zora. You think you can just walk in here and claim my property." I did not move. I just watched her unravel. "Your property, Vivian?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously soft. "Yes, my property," she screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "I am his wife. I have been his wife for 20 years. Half of everything Calvin owns belongs to me by law. That house on Maple Drive is my house. I redecorated it. I ripped out those ugly curtains your mother hung, and I made it a home fit for high society. You have absolutely no claim to it. You do not get a single brick of that estate." She was practically hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she tried to maintain her balance. It was almost fascinating to watch her brain short-circuit. She was so blinded by her hatred for me and her obsession with her own status that she completely failed to comprehend the concept of a bank foreclosure. She still believed my father had the power to give the house away in his will. I looked at her with genuine pity. "You really do not understand how finance works, do you, Vivian?" I said smoothly. "You spent 2 decades spending my father's money, but you never bothered to learn how to read a ledger. It does not matter if you are his wife. It does not matter if you redecorated the living room. Calvin used the deed as collateral for a commercial loan. He signed it away to a bank. And when he stopped making the payments, the bank as collateral for a commercial loan. He signed it away to a bank. And when he stopped making the payments, the bank took it." Vivian slammed her hand down on the table, missing the black folder by an inch. "She is faking it," she yelled, turning her erratic gaze toward my father and then to Trey. "She printed out fake documents to scare us. She is a PR fixer. This is what she does. She manufactures lies to ruin people. She wants to steal the house from us because she is jealous." My father did not look up. He just kept his face buried in his hands, the weight of his guilt keeping him pinned to his chair. Vivian grew even more furious at his silence. "Calvin, tell her she is lying," she demanded violently, shaking his shoulder. "Tell her the house is ours." When my father refused to answer, Vivian pivoted to her golden child. "Trey, do not just stand there," she snapped, her slurring voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "Call the police! Call 911 right now! I want her arrested!" Trey blinked rapidly, staring at his mother as if she were a ghost. Mom, stop, he whispered weakly. The documents are real. It has the bank seals. Dad really did it. You are completely useless, Vivian shrieked at her son, her maternal mask entirely gone. She reached clumsily into her ruined silk clutch and pulled out her own cell phone. If you will not protect this family, I will. I am calling the chief of police. I know him personally. I am going to have you locked in a cell for financial fraud, Zora. You forged federal banking documents. That is a felony. You are going to federal prison. She fumbled with the screen of her phone, her drug-numb fingers failing to unlock the device. The spectacle was so pathetic, it was almost hard to watch. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life ruling over my family with an iron fist, using manipulation and emotional abuse to keep everyone in line. But out here in the real world, where actual laws and actual money dictated the terms, she was completely powerless. Call them Vivian, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. Please call the chief of police. Tell him that Zora Zenith, the CEO of Zenith Holdings, just informed you that her firm acquired your defaulted mortgage. I am sure he will be fascinated to learn that you are trying to report the legal owner of your debt for fraud. Vivian stopped aggressively tapping her phone screen. She looked up at me, her jaw tight with unyielding stubbornness. You do not own anything. She growled, her words slurring heavily again as another wave of the sedative washed over her. You are just Calvin's mistake. You are the baggage I had to tolerate. You are not smart enough to pull this off. She threw her phone onto the table and lunged for the black folder. She grabbed the thick stack of papers with both hands and tried to rip them in half. But there were over 100 pages of heavy legal stock. Her drug-weakened hands could barely bend the spine. She let out a frustrated, humiliated cry and threw the folder back down, scattering some of the pages across the champagne-soaked tablecloth. There Vivian panted, leaning heavily against the table to keep herself upright. The documents are garbage. The house is mine. The company is ours. You are going to leave this country club right now, and you are never going to contact us again. She looked around the room, expecting the country club manager or the security guards to step forward and validate her commands. She expected the wealthy guests to nod in agreement and applaud her for putting the rebellious daughter in her place. But nobody moved. The security guards just stared at her with cold indifference. The guests looked at her with blatant disgust. You are right about one thing, Vivian, I said, keeping my tone completely even. I am never going to contact you again. Because after tonight, you will have absolutely nothing that requires my attention. You want to talk about fraud. You want to talk about stealing. Let us talk about where the rest of the company money actually went. Because my father did not just blow it all on bad real estate deals. He had a little help from the inside. Vivian's bloodshot eyes widened. The arrogant fire in her chest suddenly flickered and died, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She knew exactly what I was talking about. She glanced nervously at Lauren, who had backed so far away from the table she was almost standing in the shadows of the velvet drapery. The fight over the house was over. The reality of her poverty was setting in. But I was not going to let her pass out on the floor again until I completely exposed the final layer of her treachery. I reached into my leather tote bag one more time. It was time to introduce the second folder. I reached back into my leather tote bag, and my fingers wrapped around a second folder. This one was slim and stark white. It felt incredibly light compared to the heavy black dossier that had just destroyed my father's legacy, but the few pages inside this white folder were infinitely more lethal. I pulled it out and held it up, allowing the warm light of the crystal chandeliers to catch the glossy finish of the cover. Vivian, please, I said, gesturing toward her discarded cell phone sitting near the spilled champagne. Pick it up. Call the chief of police. Tell him you want to report a massive financial crime. Tell him you want to press charges for fraud. I strongly encourage you to do it right now because it will save my lawyers the trouble of having to file the police report themselves tomorrow morning. Vivian stared at the white folder, her drug-addled brain struggling to process my sudden shift in tone. She did not reach for the phone. She just gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white as she tried to keep herself standing. I slid the white folder across the smooth surface of the table. It glided past the ruined floral arrangement and stopped exactly halfway between Trey and Lauren. Lauren flinched violently, stepping back so fast her high heel caught on the hem of her wet dress. She stumbled, catching herself on the back of an empty chair. Her face was the color of chalk. Trey looked down at the white folder. His eyes were wide and frantic like a trapped animal waiting for the final blow. "What is this?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What else could you possibly have, Zora? The company is broke. The house is gone. What else is there?" "There is the matter of the missing cash tray," I replied, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. "When I was auditing the company payroll accounts, I noticed something strange. The business was hemorrhaging money on the downtown plaza project as we established. But not all of that money was going to unpaid contractors or bad loans. A very significant portion of it was being routed through a series of shell companies and phantom vendors." My father lifted his head from his hands, his eyes red and swollen. "What are you talking about?" he croaked. "We never used shell companies. You did not, Dad." I said, my gaze shifting to Lauren. "But someone with high-level administrative access to the corporate accounts did. Someone who kindly offered to help manage the bookkeeping because her poor husband was just so stressed and overworked." Trey slowly turned his head to look at his wife. Lauren was shaking her head rapidly, her eyes wide with manufactured panic. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, Trey, do not listen to her. She is trying to turn us against each other. She hates me. You know she hates me." I reached out and flipped the white folder open. "Open your eyes, Trey," I commanded. "Look at the bank statements. Look at the wire transfer receipts." Trey looked down. The top page was a detailed bank ledger printed on heavy watermarked paper. It documented dozens of wire transfers ranging from $10,000 to $50,000 each. They were carefully staggered to avoid triggering federal banking alerts, but over the course of 18 months, they added up to a staggering sum. $385,000, I said, reading the exact total from memory. Transferred directly from the family company operating fund to a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. It was brilliant, really. The company was already losing so much money that nobody noticed a few extra invoices being paid to consulting firms that did not actually exist. Trey stared at the numbers, the reality of the theft washing over him. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely a breath. "Who owns the offshore account?" I looked directly at Lauren. My voice was calm, cold, and absolute. "The account is registered to a woman named Lauren Davis." The silence that followed was absolute. The name Davis was Lauren's maiden name. It was the name she had before she married into our wealthy family, before she put on the designer clothes and the innocent smile. It was a name my father and brother had completely forgotten, but it was sitting right there on the official banking documents stamped by the International Wire Authority. Trey stared at the name on the paper. The letters seemed to burn themselves into his retinas. He looked back up at his wife. The golden child, the arrogant heir to a ruined empire, was suddenly reduced to a broken, confused boy. "Lauren," he said, his voice shaking with a devastating mixture of betrayal and disbelief. "Lauren, what is this? Is this your account?" Lauren let go of the chair and took another step back, pressing herself against the heavy velvet drapery covering the ballroom wall. She was cornered, and she knew it. The white tears, the fragile victim act, the innocent demeanor, none of it was going to save her from a paper trail this clear. "Trey, I can explain," she stammered, her eyes darting around the room looking for any possible escape route. "It is not what it looks like. I was just setting up a safety net." "The business was failing, Trey. I saw the numbers before you did. I knew your father was taking out terrible loans. I was just trying to protect our future. I was going to tell you." "Protect your future," I repeated, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You mean your future, Lauren, because that offshore account is a sole proprietorship. Trey's name is nowhere on it. You were not building a safety net for your marriage. You were building an escape pod. You were systematically draining the last drops of cash from my father's company so that when the bankruptcy finally hit and the banks came to repossess the cars and the house, you could file for divorce and walk away a very rich woman. The guests at the surrounding tables gasped in collective shock. This was the ultimate scandal. It was one thing for a business to fail due to incompetence. It was an entirely different level of betrayal for a wife to actively rob her husband's family while playing the role of the devoted supportive partner. My father stared at Lauren with pure venom. "You stole from me!" he roared, suddenly finding his voice again. "I welcomed you into my home. I paid for your lavish wedding. I treated you like my own daughter, and you were stealing from me the entire time." Lauren snapped. The delicate, innocent facade she had worn for 5 years completely shattered, falling away to reveal the cold, calculating woman underneath. She stopped shaking. She stopped crying. She stood up straight and glared right back at my father, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Oh, please, Calvin." Lauren spat her voice, losing its soft melodic tone and becoming sharp and vicious. "Do not act like you are the victim here. You ruined this family all by yourself. You handed a multi-million-dollar company to a boy who does not even know how to read a profit and loss statement. Trey spent half his time playing golf and the other half buying ridiculous sports cars to impress his friends. The company was going to collapse with or without my help. I just made sure I got paid for having to tolerate this miserable family." Trey looked as though he had been physically struck in the chest. He stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the table to keep from falling. "You used me," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "I survived you." Lauren shot back, her lip curling into a sneer. "I saw the writing on the wall 2 years ago. This entire family is built on lies and arrogance. I was just the only one smart enough to cash out before the ship sank." Vivian, who had been leaning against the table in a stunned silence, suddenly let out a furious scream. She lunged awkwardly toward Lauren, her drug-heavy limbs flailing in the air. "You little blonde witch!" Vivian screeched, grabbing a handful of Lauren's wet dress. "I knew you were trash the day Trey brought you home. I am going to tear your hair out." Lauren shrieked and shoved Vivian backward. Vivian stumbled her high heels, slipping on the spilled champagne, and she crashed hard into Trey's chest. Trey caught his mother, but the momentum sent them both tumbling backward onto the floor in a tangled mess of ruined silk and expensive tuxedo fabric. It was a scene of absolute pathetic chaos. The grand, sophisticated anniversary dinner had devolved into a physical brawl over stolen money. The wealthy elite guests were watching with wide eyes, some even pulling out their cell phones to record the spectacular downfall of the city's premier real estate family. I sat perfectly still, sipping my clean champagne and watching the destruction. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to throw a single punch. I had simply handed them the truth and watched them tear each other apart. The police would be highly interested in the white folder sitting on the table. But before the authorities arrived, there was still one final legal maneuver I needed to execute. I placed my glass down and looked over at the back of the room, waiting for my final guest to make his entrance. Mr. Sterling finally decided he had seen enough of the physical altercation. He raised 2 fingers, and the heavy-set security guards stepped forward, moving with practiced efficiency. They reached into the tangled pile of ruined, expensive fabrics on the floor and hauled my stepmother upward. Vivian thrashed weakly, her drug-heavy limbs uncoordinated as they deposited her forcefully into an empty chair. She slumped forward, panting heavily, her ruined emerald gown dripping cold water onto the polished marble. Trey scrambled backward across the floor, scrambling away from his wife as if she had suddenly caught fire. He pulled himself up, using the edge of the table, his custom tuxedo jacket ripped at the seam. He stared at Lauren, who was slowly standing up and smoothing down the wet fabric of her designer dress. Her blonde hair was disheveled, but her face was completely devoid of the terrified victim she had been playing all night. She looked like a cornered snake, calculating her next strike. Trey looked desperately at the white folder still resting on the tablecloth. He reached out with a trembling hand and pulled it closer to him. He flipped to the second page, his eyes scanning the long columns of banking data. You told me you did not know anything about the company finances, Trey said, his voice breaking. He sounded like a lost child. You told me numbers gave you anxiety, Lauren. You made me hire a second accountant just to handle the household bills because you said it was too overwhelming. I picked up my glass of sparkling water and took a slow sip. She did not have anxiety, Trey, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet ballroom. She had ambition, and you made it incredibly easy for her. Look at the transaction dates next to those wire transfers. Read them out loud. Trey swallowed hard, a drop of sweat rolling down the side of his face. October 14th, he read, his voice barely a whisper. $50,000 transferred to the Davis Island Trust. I smiled a cold, humorless smile. Does that date ring a bell, Trey? I asked. Let me jog your memory. October 14th was the exact same week your loving wife told you she was feeling emotionally depleted by the stress of city life. She told you she needed a spiritual reset. So you paid for her to spend 8 days at a luxury holistic yoga retreat in Grand Cayman. You even bought her first-class tickets because she said the extra legroom helped her align her chakras. Trey looked up from the paper, his face twisting in agony. You went to the Caymans to find yourself, he asked Lauren. She went to the Caymans to fund herself, Trey Wars corrected sharply. She needed to be physically present on the island to sign the establishment papers for the offshore trust. You cannot open a tax-sheltered account of that magnitude over the internet. You have to walk into the bank, hand them the paperwork, and provide a signature. While you were sitting here in the city playing golf and pretending to be a real estate mogul, she was sitting in a tropical bank lobby funneling your inheritance into her private vault. Lauren did not deny it. She did not even look ashamed. She just crossed her arms over her chest and rolled her eyes. Keep reading, Trey, I commanded. Trey looked back down at the ledger, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled against the table. March 2nd, he read. $45,000. The advanced meditation seminar I provided, nodding slowly. She told you the October retreat was so successful that she needed to return for an intensive silent meditation weekend. She said she would not have her phone on her for 3 days. It turns out she was not meditating. She was meeting with her wealth manager to secure the second round of embezzled funds. Trey flipped to the next page, a suffocating sob building in his throat. June 18th, he gasped. $60,000. The wellness spa in the Bahamas, I replied instantly. August 9th. $75,000. The holistic healing cruise. Every single time she claimed she needed space, every time she played the exhausted, devoted wife needing a break from the pressure of supporting your massive career, she was actively robbing you blind. She used the company operating account, like her own personal automated teller machine. Trey stared at Lauren, his eyes brimming with tears. How could you do this to me? He asked, his voice cracking with pure devastation. I gave you everything. I bought you that diamond bracelet you are wearing. I bought you the car you drive. I defended you every single time my sister tried to question your motives. I loved you. Lauren let out a sharp, cruel laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of the sweet, innocent girl she had pretended to be for half a decade. You did not love me, Trey Lawrence sneered, stepping out from the shadows of the drapery. You loved how I made you look. You loved having a pretty blonde wife to show off at your country club dinners. You loved that I played dumb so you could feel like a big, strong businessman. But you are not a businessman, Trey. You are a massive joke. The surrounding guests gasped, whispering furiously to one another. Lauren ignored them entirely, her eyes locked intensely on the broken man she had married. Do you have any idea how easy it was to steal from you? Lauren asked, stepping closer to him, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. You never once looked at the payroll ledgers. You never asked to see the contractor invoices. You were so desperate to impress your father and so desperate to pretend you were successful that you just blindly signed whatever paperwork I put in front of you. I would slide a wire transfer authorization right next to your dinner plate, and you would sign it without even glancing at the payee. You practically handed me the money. Trey stumbled backward, bumping into the empty chair behind him. He looked completely destroyed, stripped of every illusion he had ever held about his life. His beautiful wife, his successful career, his golden status in the family, it was all a meticulously crafted lie, designed to extract as much cash as possible before the inevitable collapse. "You are a monster," Trey whispered, burying his face in his hands. "I am a survivor," Lauren shot back, her eyes flashing with cold calculation. "I grew up with nothing. I was not going to let your pathetic incompetence drag me down into bankruptcy. I earned every single penny in that offshore account for having to smile and nod while you talked about your stupid luxury condominium project that everyone in the city knew was going to fail." Lauren turned her head and looked directly at me. The smug satisfaction on her face hardened into a fierce defensive glare. She knew the game was entirely up. She knew her marriage was over and her secret was out. But Lauren was a master manipulator, and she was not about to go down without throwing one last desperate punch. She looked around the room, taking in the faces of the wealthy white country club members who were watching the drama unfold. I could see the gears turning in her head. She was preparing to shift the narrative one final time, to use the only weapon she had left against me. Lauren took a deep, shuddering breath, and her entire physical demeanor transformed in the blink of an eye. The cold, calculating sneer vanished. She suddenly dropped her shoulders, shrinking her posture to make herself look small and fragile. She pushed a wet strand of blonde hair out of her face with a violently trembling hand. She turned away from her devastated husband and looked directly at the surrounding tables, specifically targeting the older, wealthy white men who were watching the scene unfold. "You are attacking me!" Lauren cried out, pitching her voice to a frantic, breathy register that echoed perfectly across the grand ballroom. "Why are you doing this to me, Zora? You have always been so aggressive toward me. You are an angry, intimidating woman, and you are terrifying everyone in this room." She took another step backward, pressing her hands against her chest. "I am just a wife trying to survive a toxic family," she sobbed loudly, her voice echoing with manufactured panic. "Please, somebody help me. She is threatening me. I do not feel safe. She is going to hurt me." It was a brilliant, terrifyingly effective piece of theater. In a matter of seconds, Lauren had attempted to rewrite the entire narrative of the evening. She was no longer the cunning embezzler who had systematically drained a family business and destroyed her husband's life. She was a delicate damsel in distress surrounded by danger, and I was the aggressive, hostile black woman inexplicably terrorizing her. She was tapping into centuries of deep-seated racial biases and social conditioning, begging the room to ignore the financial documents on the table and react solely to her white tears. I watched the subtle shift in the room. The psychological trap Lauren set was instantly recognizable. At the table closest to us, a silver-haired man in a navy suit half stood from his chair, his chest puffed out instinctively, activating his savior complex. Two other men nearby exchanged tense glances, murmuring to each other and looking at me with sudden suspicion. The facts did not matter to them in that brief emotional moment. All they saw was a crying blonde woman asking for protection. My father and Trey remained completely silent. They were too broken by their own financial ruin to defend me or even to stop Lauren's performance. They just sat there letting her weaponize her fragility against me exactly as they had done for the past 5 years. If I had raised my voice, if I had slammed my hand on the table or taken a single aggressive step toward her, Lauren would have won. She would have perfectly validated the dangerous stereotype she was trying to force onto me. The security guards would have stepped in, the police would have been called for a domestic disturbance, and the reality of her massive corporate theft would have been buried under the spectacle of an angry confrontation. But I am a crisis management executive. I make my living dismantling psychological traps, and I refuse to play a rigged game. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back comfortably in my chair, crossed my legs, and picked up my crystal water goblet. I took a slow, deliberate sip, maintaining absolute, unbreakable eye contact with Lauren over the rim of the glass. The sheer, relaxed confidence of my posture stood in stark contrast to her frantic, hyperventilating act. The silver-haired man who had half stood to rescue her hesitated, hovering awkwardly above his chair. He looked from Lauren's trembling hands to my perfectly calm, unbothered expression. The illusion Lauren was trying to cast began to instantly crack under the weight of my total indifference. I lowered my glass and set it gently on the table. "Save the white tears, Lauren." I said, my voice incredibly calm, smooth, and pitched just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear every single syllable. "They do not work on me, and they certainly do not work on bank statements." Lauren gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, acting as though I had just physically struck her. "How can you be so cruel?" she wept, looking back at the wealthy guests for backup. "She is bullying me." I slowly stood up, smoothing the front of my dress. I did not move toward her. I simply stood my ground, radiating the quiet, absolute authority of a woman who owned the room. "You are not a victim, Lauren," I stated clearly, stripping away the emotional manipulation with cold, hard facts. "You are a white-collar criminal. You are a thief who just got caught embezzling nearly $400,000 from your husband's family. You routed stolen corporate funds through phantom vendors to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under your maiden name." I turned my head slightly, addressing the silent crowd of elite guests without ever losing sight of Lauren. "She is insulting your intelligence," I said, speaking directly to the wealthy patrons who had been ready to jump to her defense a moment ago. "She thinks because she can turn on the waterworks and play the fragile, innocent wife that you will completely ignore the legally subpoenaed wire transfer receipts sitting right here on this table. She is trying to use my race and your implicit biases as a shield so she can walk out of this building with stolen money. Are you really going to let her play you like that?" The effect was instantaneous. The silver-haired man slowly sat back down in his chair, his face flushing a deep shade of embarrassed crimson. The other guests, who had been leaning forward in sympathy, suddenly leaned back, crossing their arms and looking at Lauren with profound disgust. In the cutthroat world of the financial elite, there was nothing more offensive than someone assuming you were stupid enough to fall for a cheap distraction. They respected money, and they respected the law. Lauren had violated both, and then tried to treat them like gullible fools. Lauren looked around the grand ballroom, her wide, frantic eyes searching for a single sympathetic face. She found absolutely no one. The wealthy men had abandoned their savior complexes. The society women were whispering to each other, shaking their heads in judgment. Mr. Sterling, the manager, stood near the doors with his security team, his face completely impassive, refusing to offer her any shelter. She was completely isolated. The ultimate defense mechanism, the weapon she had used her entire life to escape accountability, had spectacularly failed. Lauren slowly lowered her hands from her face. The fake tears instantly stopped flowing. Her shoulders dropped and the trembling ceased. The sudden, terrifyingly fast transition from a weeping victim back to a cold, calculating woman sent a visible shiver through the crowd. They realized in real time exactly how thoroughly she had been trying to manipulate them. "You are a miserable, hateful person, Zora." Lauren spat, her voice dropping back to its normal sharp register. "No," I replied, resting my hands on the back of my chair. "I am just the auditor, and your account is completely overdrawn." Lauren glared at me, her chest heaving with genuine fury this time. She opened her mouth to launch another insult, to try and find some other angle of attack, but she was suddenly cut off by a harsh, bitter laugh coming from the floor. We had all been so focused on Lauren's dramatic performance that we had momentarily forgotten about the other snake in the grass. Vivian had been sitting slumped in her chair, slowly metabolizing the heavy sedatives and absorbing every single word of Lauren's confession. And Vivian, despite her many deep flaws, possessed an ego that absolutely refused to be outdone by a daughter-in-law she had always secretly despised. Vivian gripped the arms of her chair, pulling herself upright with a sudden burst of adrenaline. The heavy sedatives were still clouding her eyes, but her sheer hatred for Lauren cut right through the chemical haze. She pointed a trembling finger at the blonde woman standing by the velvet curtains. You did not survive anything, you little parasite. Vivian spat her words, slurring slightly but dripping with venom. You masterminded this entire operation. Do not stand there and act like you were just a terrified wife trying to build a safety net. You came to me with the offshore accounts. You showed me how to bypass the internal audits. Lauren whipped her head around, her eyes wide with fury. She took a threatening step toward Vivian, completely abandoning her fragile victim act. Shut your mouth, Vivian, Lauren hissed. You were the one who gave me the administrative passwords. You were the one who told me Calvin was too stupid to check the ledger. You wanted the money hidden just as badly as I did, so you could buy your ridiculous emerald necklaces and fund your secret gambling trips to Monaco. The entire ballroom let out a collective gasp. The elite guests leaned in closer, completely captivated by the grotesque display of two wealthy women tearing each other apart over stolen money. My father, Calvin, let out a choked sound, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he realized the depth of the betrayal. His own wife had colluded with his daughter-in-law to rob him blind. Trey looked back and forth between his mother and his wife, his face pale and completely devoid of comprehension. They had both used him. They had both recognized his profound incompetence and exploited it to drain his inheritance right under his nose. I am the matriarch of this family, Vivian shrieked, slamming her hand onto the damp tablecloth. I deserved that money. I spent 20 years putting up with Calvin's massive ego and his failing business ventures. I earned my cut. But you, Lauren, you are just a gold digger who married my idiot son for a blank check. You took the wire transfers and funneled the majority into your own maiden name. You tried to cut me out of my own embezzlement scheme. Lauren let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Your scheme? Lauren mocked, her voice echoing sharply across the room. You could not even figure out how to open a secure email attachment, Vivian. I had to set up the shell companies because you are a dinosaur who barely knows how to use a smartphone. I did all the heavy lifting. I forged the vendor invoices. I manipulated Trey into signing the authorization forms. You just sat by the pool drinking martinis and demanding your 50% cut. You greedy little witch, Vivian roared, trying to stand up again but failing as her legs gave out. You told me the Cayman account was a joint trust. You told me my name was on the registration documents. I protected you from Zora. Every time Zora tried to audit the payroll, I distracted Calvin and forced him to shut her down. I protected your theft and you stole my half of the money. I sat back and watched the magnificent implosion of their criminal partnership. They were so consumed by their own greed and their hatred for each other that they completely forgot they were confessing to multiple federal felonies into a live microphone just a few feet away. The country club manager, Mr. Sterling, was already quietly speaking into his radio, undoubtedly coordinating with the local authorities. You did not protect anyone but yourself, Vivian Lauren snapped, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. You only distracted Calvin because you knew if Zora looked too closely at the books, she would find the $200,000 you siphoned out to pay for your cosmetic surgeries and your private luxury shoppers. Do not act like you were doing me a favor. We had a business arrangement, and you were a terrible partner. You paid for your brother's college tuition with my husband's money, Vivian screamed, pointing an accusing finger at Lauren's face. Do not think I did not see those bank statements. You siphoned off $30,000 just to keep your white trash family out of debt while we were bleeding cash on the downtown plaza project. And what about your fake charity galas? Lauren fired back, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. You hosted 3 charity dinners last year and pocketed 70% of the donations to pay off your private credit cards. You are a complete fraud, Vivian. You are nothing but a thief wearing expensive silk. My father slowly stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the marble floor. He looked like a man who had just aged 20 years in 20 minutes. His shoulders were slumped, his breathing shallow and erratic. He looked at Vivian, the woman he had chosen over his own daughter, the woman he had blindly defended for 2 decades. You stole from me, Calvin whispered, his voice breaking with profound devastation. You both stole from me. You sat at my dinner table, you lived in my house, you spent my money, and you were plotting to destroy me the entire time. Vivian sneered at him, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure contempt. Oh, grow up, Calvin, she spat, dismissing his pain completely. You destroyed yourself. You were so desperate to feel like a powerful, successful man that you let me tell you whatever you wanted to hear. You liked the lie. You liked that I stroked your ego and let you pretend you were a king. You paid for the illusion, and the illusion was expensive. Lauren crossed her arms and nodded in agreement, her temporary alliance with Vivian returning now that they shared a common enemy. She is right, Calvin Lauren added coldly. You were an easy mark. You and Trey both. You wanted a beautiful, submissive wife to make you look good in front of your wealthy friends. You never wanted a real partner. So I played the part, and I charged you for the performance. It is called capitalism. Trey let out a loud, agonizing sob. He dropped to his knees right there on the wet carpet, completely broken. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly in front of 200 elite guests. The golden child, the arrogant heir who had spent his entire life looking down on me, was finally experiencing the real world. His mother and his wife were standing over him, proudly detailing exactly how they had exploited his stupidity to rob him of everything he owned. They did not even look at him. Vivian and Lauren were entirely focused on destroying each other, trying to establish dominance in a sinking ship. They were screaming over each other now, trading vicious insults about stolen jewelry, fake designer bags, and secret bank accounts. They were doing my job for me. I had brought the matches, but they were eagerly pouring the gasoline over their own heads. I looked down at the white folder sitting on the table. The documents inside were legally airtight. The wire transfers, the shell companies, the forged signatures, it was all there in black and white. And now I had their verbal confessions witnessed by an entire ballroom of influential people. There was absolutely no way out for either of them. The surrounding guests were watching in a state of horrified fascination. The high society veneer had been completely stripped away, leaving only the ugly, greedy reality of a family rotting from the inside out. I could see the disgust in their eyes. They would never do business with Calvin again. They would never invite Trey to their golf tournaments, and they would certainly never allow Vivian or Lauren into their exclusive social circles. The social exile was going to be just as devastating as the financial ruin. I picked up my napkin and gently dabbed the corner of my mouth. The screaming match between the stepmother and the daughter-in-law was reaching a fever pitch. Vivian was trying to throw a glass of water at Lauren, but her drug-numb fingers slipped and the glass shattered on the floor. Lauren retaliated by kicking Vivian's ruined emerald dress. It was a pathetic, undignified end to their reign of terror. But I knew the grand finale was approaching. I could hear the faint sound of sirens wailing in the distance, growing steadily louder. The authorities were finally arriving to clean up the mess. I turned my attention back to my father, waiting to see what the proud patriarch would do now that his entire kingdom had been burned to ashes by the women he worshipped. The distant wail of police sirens pierced through the heavy walls of the Oakmont Country Club. The sound was faint at first, but it was growing steadily louder, cutting through the chaotic shouting of my stepmother and my sister-in-law. My father heard the sirens. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He staggered forward, his hand flying up to clutch his chest. He gripped the fabric of his tuxedo shirt, his fingers twisting the expensive material as his breathing became rapid and shallow. The reality of his situation had finally bypassed his massive ego and struck him directly in the heart. The police were coming. His wife and his daughter-in-law had just publicly confessed to multiple federal felonies, including wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. His golden child son was curled up on the wet floor, weeping uncontrollably. His prestigious real estate empire was bankrupt. His ancestral home was foreclosed. And the 200 elite guests in the room, the politicians, the developers, and the socialites, whose respect he craved more than oxygen, were watching his total destruction with naked disgust. Calvin realized in that agonizing moment that his entire life was a carefully decorated corpse. He had absolutely nothing left to protect him. He turned away from the pathetic brawl happening on the floor. He stumbled around the edge of the large circular table, knocking over an empty wine glass. It shattered against the marble floor, but he did not even look down. He walked directly toward me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a frantic, terrified desperation. Zora. He gasped, his voice barely a rasping whisper. He grabbed the back of the empty chair next to me to keep his balance. Zora, please. I remained seated, holding my crystal goblet of sparkling water. I looked up at the man who had spent 35 years making sure I felt like an unwelcome guest in my own family. The towering, arrogant patriarch who used to dismiss my achievements and silence my opinions was entirely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified old man begging for a lifeline. "You have to fix this," Calvin pleaded, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom. "You are a crisis manager. This is what you do. You handle public relations disasters for billionaires. You make scandals disappear. You have the money. You have the resources. You can stop this before it hits the morning papers." I slowly set my glass down on the table. "Are you asking me to clean up your mess, Dad?" I asked, my tone completely flat. "I am asking you to save this family," he begged, leaning over the chair, his knuckles turning white. "I will do whatever you want, Zora. I see it now. I see how blind I was. Trey is weak. He is completely useless. He let that blonde parasite manipulate him and steal my money. And Vivian, she is a monster. I will divorce her. I will throw her to the wolves." He was speaking so fast the words were tripping over each other. It was incredibly revealing to watch how quickly he abandoned the people he had protected for decades the second they became a liability. He had no real loyalty to Trey or Vivian. He only cared about his own image. And right now, I was the only person in the room with enough power to salvage what was left of it. "I will call the estate lawyers first thing tomorrow morning," Calvin continued, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his wrinkled cheeks. "I will strike Trey from the trust entirely. I will write Vivian out of the will. I will give you everything, Zora. I will step down and name you the sole chief executive officer of the development firm. You will be the head of the family. You will have the absolute final say on every single project. Just please call the police chief and tell him to turn the squad cars around. Use your influence. Pay off the debts. Save the company name." He looked at me with a pathetic, hopeful expression. He truly believed he was offering me the ultimate prize. He thought I was still that little girl desperate for his validation, desperate to be chosen over my brother. He thought the title of CEO was a magic key that would instantly erase a lifetime of emotional neglect and financial abuse. He believed that because he finally recognized my worth, I would immediately drop everything to protect him. I looked at his desperate, tear-stained face. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, no residual childhood longing. The emotional cord had been cut a long time ago. "Dad?" I said, my voice incredibly calm and perfectly clear. "You cannot give me what I already took." Calvin's breath hitched in his throat. The hopeful, frantic light in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a deep, paralyzing confusion. What he whispered. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. I surveyed the wreckage of the table before returning my gaze to him. "You think you still have a company to give away?" I asked. "You think the CEO title actually means anything right now? Your firm is completely insolvent. You have defaulted on 3 major commercial loans. Your operating accounts were drained by your wife and your daughter-in-law. You have 0 liquid capital and $14 million in toxic debt." "I have the brand," Calvin argued weakly, his voice shaking. "The company name still has value in this city. If you inject capital, we can rebuild. You will be in charge." I let out a slow, humorless laugh. "I do not need to inject capital into your sinking ship, Dad. I already own the ocean." I reached forward and tapped the thick black folder sitting on the table. "I told you, my private equity firm specializes in acquiring distressed assets. I did not just buy the Oakmont Country Club. And I did not just buy the defaulted mortgage on my mother's house. 6 weeks ago, when your primary commercial lenders were preparing to freeze your corporate accounts and initiate a hostile liquidation, I stepped in. Zenith Holdings purchased the entirety of your corporate debt portfolio. Calvin stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. His brain was desperately trying to process the magnitude of what I was telling him. I am your primary secured creditor, Dad, I stated, leaving no room for misunderstanding. I hold the paper on every single piece of heavy machinery you lease. I hold the deeds to your commercial lots. I own the construction contracts. I own the downtown plaza project. Your company belongs to me. I did not need your permission to take it, and I certainly do not need you to rewrite your meaningless will to grant me a title I already hold. He collapsed into the empty chair beside me, his legs completely giving out. He stared blankly at the wet tablecloth, the fight entirely drained from his body. "You let me believe I was still in control," he whispered, his eyes fixed on nothing. "You let me walk into this ballroom tonight thinking I was the king." "You demanded to be the king, Dad," I corrected him sharply. "You demanded that everyone bow down to your fragile ego. You demanded that I smile and play nice while Vivian insulted me and Trey flaunted the money he stole from my mother's legacy. I did not force you to be arrogant. I just let you operate under your own delusions until the bill came due. And the bill is due tonight." Calvin buried his face in his trembling hands. The sound of the approaching sirens was deafening now. Red and blue emergency lights began to flash through the sheer curtains of the grand ballroom windows, casting long, erratic shadows across the imported marble floor. The reality of his complete and total destruction was literally parked outside the front doors. "I am not going to call the police chief to stop this," I told him, my voice cold and absolute. "I am the one who had my legal team call them an hour ago. Vivian tampered with my drink and committed aggravated assault. Lauren committed wire fraud. And you committed corporate malfeasance. The authorities are not here to protect your reputation, Calvin. They are here to collect the criminals." My father began to weep, a quiet, broken sound that barely registered over the wailing sirens outside. He had sacrificed his daughter to protect his pride, and now his pride was entirely gone. He had nothing to offer me. He had no leverage, no power, and no legacy. He was just a bankrupt old man sitting in a building he used to belong to, waiting for the police to arrest his wife. I did not offer him a tissue. I did not reach out to comfort him. I simply picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water and turned my attention toward the heavy double doors at the back of the room. The country club manager, Mr. Sterling, stepped forward, pulling the brass handles open to admit the local authorities. The grand finale of the evening had finally arrived, and I wanted to have a perfect view of the exit. Mr. Sterling held the heavy brass doors open. Two uniformed police officers stepped into the grand ballroom, their radios crackling quietly in the silent room. The flashing red and blue lights from their cruisers outside painted the walls in sharp, erratic strokes. But before I allowed the authorities to step into the absolute mess my family had created, I needed to ensure the legal cage was permanently locked. I did not want my father or my brother to harbor any lingering delusions that they could somehow fight me in court tomorrow morning. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. At a secluded table near the back of the room, a man in a sharp charcoal suit placed his linen napkin neatly next to his half-eaten prime rib. His name was Harrison, and he was the senior partner at the most ruthless corporate law firm on the East Coast. I had retained his services the moment I decided to dismantle my father's empire. Harrison stood up, picked up a thick leather briefcase from the floor, and walked purposefully across the marble floor. The wealthy guests watched him part the crowd. My father looked up at the approaching lawyer, his eyes filled with a new wave of sheer terror. He knew exactly who Harrison was. Every real estate developer in the city knew Harrison. He was the man you called when you wanted to completely obliterate a rival company. Harrison arrived at our table and gave me a brief professional nod. "Good evening, Zora," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. "I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but I have the final executed documents you requested." He unlatched his leather briefcase and pulled out 3 thick legal binders, dropping them onto the table right next to the ruined floral arrangement. Calvin Harrison said, turning his attention to my father. "It is a profound disappointment to see you in this position, but business is business. On behalf of Zenith Holdings, I am officially serving you with the final notices of asset seizure and corporate foreclosure." Harrison opened the first binder. It was not just a summary sheet like the folders I had shown them earlier. These were the actual legally binding court-stamped documents signed by a federal judge just 4 hours prior. When your primary lenders began preparing to force your company into Chapter 7, liquidation, Harrison explained, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. They were eager to offload the toxic debt. My client stepped in and purchased the entirety of your commercial obligations. She also purchased the defaulted mortgage on the residential property located on Maple Drive. As of 5 o'clock this evening, the grace period for repayment expired. Zenith Holdings is now legally your sole primary creditor. Trey stared at the binders, his mouth hanging open. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice shaking. "What does sole creditor mean?" "It means," Harrison replied, looking down at my brother with absolute disdain, "you own absolutely nothing. Your corporate bank accounts have been frozen and legally seized. The deeds to your commercial lots have been transferred. The keys to your company vehicles are currently being confiscated by repo agents, and the house you grew up in belongs entirely to your sister. You do not have a company to rebuild. You do not have an inheritance to claim. You are legally broke." My father let out a low, agonizing groan. He reached out and touched the embossed seal on the top document, tracing the rigid lines of the federal stamp. The reality was undeniable. He could not charm his way out of this. He could not bully his way out of this. The law had spoken, and the law said I owned him. Lauren, who had been standing silently by the curtains, realized the terrifying implication of Harrison's words. She stepped forward, her eyes wide. "Wait," Lauren said, her voice trembling. "If the company accounts are frozen, what about the offshore trust?" Harrison smiled a cold, predatory smile. "Ah, yes, the Davis Island Trust," he said, pulling a single sheet of paper from his inner jacket pocket. "My client brought that to my attention during the audit. Since those funds were embezzled directly from the seized corporate accounts, they are legally classified as stolen assets belonging to Zenith Holdings. I filed an emergency international injunction this afternoon. The Cayman authorities have frozen your account, Lauren. You cannot withdraw a single dime." Lauren's knees buckled. She grabbed the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. All her scheming, all her manipulation, all the years she spent pretending to love a man she despised, it was all for absolutely nothing. She was trapped in the exact same financial ruin she had tried to escape. The legal checkmate was absolute. I had systematically stripped them of their wealth, their power, and their fake reputations. I owned the board, and I had captured all their pieces. The 2 police officers finally reached our table. They looked around at the shattered glass, the spilled champagne, the ruined designer dresses, and the weeping family members. Mr. Sterling stepped up beside them, gesturing toward the chaotic scene. "Officers," Mr. Sterling said, keeping his voice calm and professional, "we have a situation here regarding massive corporate fraud and physical tampering." Vivian, who had been slumped quietly in her chair, suddenly jerked her head up. The sight of the police uniforms seemed to trigger a massive surge of desperate survival instinct in her drug-addled brain. She realized that she was not just facing bankruptcy and divorce. She was facing actual prison time for her part in the embezzlement scheme. Backed into an inescapable corner with absolutely no money and no power remaining, Vivian decided to play the only card she had left. It was a desperate nuclear option designed to take me down with her. She pushed herself up from the chair, her ruined emerald gown clinging to her legs. She pointed a shaking, crooked finger directly at my face and let out a blood-curdling scream. "Arrest her!" Vivian shrieked, her voice tearing through the silent ballroom. "Arrest that woman right now! She tried to kill me!" The two police officers immediately put their hands on their duty belts, their postures shifting from investigative to highly alert. They looked at Vivian and then turned their sharp gazes toward me. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, holding up a hand to calm Vivian down. "Please step back. Who tried to kill you?" Vivian stumbled forward, grabbing the officer's arm. "Zora," she sobbed, forcing thick fake tears to stream down her face. "My stepdaughter. She poisoned me. She dropped drugs into my champagne glass when I was not looking. She is trying to stage a hostile takeover of my husband's company, and she wanted to eliminate me. I drank it, and I collapsed. Look at me. I am barely conscious. I am having heart palpitations. She committed attempted murder." The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers. Even Lauren and Trey stopped crying and stared at Vivian, stunned by the sheer audacity of her lie. My father looked back and forth between me and his wife, his brain completely unable to process the rapidly escalating chaos. "Officer, you have to believe me," Vivian pleaded, clinging to his uniform sleeve. "She is a ruthless corporate fixer. She buys bankrupt companies and destroys families. She invited us here tonight to humiliate us, and when I tried to stop her, she poisoned my drink. Search her bag. I guarantee you will find the drugs in her purse." The second officer took a slow, deliberate step toward me. "Miss," he said, his voice stern and commanding, "I am going to need you to step away from the table and keep your hands where I can see them." I did not panic. I did not raise my voice in protest. I simply stood up and smoothly placed my hands flat on the top of the linen tablecloth. Vivian was staring at me with a look of pure malicious triumph. She thought she had found the perfect loophole. She knew her reputation was destroyed, but if she could convince the police that I was an attempted murderer, my credibility would be ruined. My corporate clients would drop me. My equity firm would face intense federal scrutiny, and I would spend the night in a holding cell. It was the ultimate revenge of a desperate narcissistic woman. "She poisoned me," Vivian repeated, sinking dramatically to the floor to emphasize her supposed medical distress. "She tried to kill her own family for money." The officer pulled out his notepad. "Ma'am, we are going to need paramedics to evaluate you," he told Vivian before turning back to me. "Miss, I need your full name and identification. If there is any truth to this allegation, you will be taken into custody immediately pending a toxicology report." I looked down at Vivian, who was pretending to hyperventilate on the carpet. "You really never learn, do you, Vivian?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm, echoing in the tense silence of the room. "You always assume you are the smartest person in the room. You assume nobody is paying attention to your dirty tricks. But you forgot whose house you are standing in." Before the officer could ask me to turn around, a clear, confident voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "Excuse me, officers," the voice said. "Do not arrest her. The woman on the floor is lying." The crowd parted, and Aisha, the catering manager, stepped out of the shadows. She was still wearing her crisp black uniform, but she was no longer holding a stack of rolled towels. In her hands, she held a large silver iPad Pro. She walked directly up to the police officers, her posture straight and completely fearless. "My name is Aisha," she said, introducing herself clearly. "I am the head of catering and security management for the Oakmont Country Club. Miss Zora did not poison anyone tonight. The woman on the floor poisoned herself." Vivian's fake hyperventilating instantly stopped. She froze on the carpet, her eyes wide with sudden terror as she stared at the young black woman holding the tablet. "That is a lie," Vivian screamed, scrambling backward. "She works for Zora. She is covering for her boss. Do not listen to her." Aisha did not even look at Vivian. She simply tapped the screen of the iPad and held it out for the two police officers to see. "Our grand ballroom is equipped with 4 high-definition security cameras," Aisha explained, her tone perfectly professional. "We upgraded the system 6 months ago when Zenith Holdings purchased the property. The cameras record in full 4K resolution with optical zoom." I was stationed in the security office monitoring the dinner service when I noticed something highly suspicious at the head table. The officers leaned in to look at the bright screen. I could see the video playing reflecting in their eyes. It was crystal clear. The footage showed the entire head table from an elevated angle. It showed me standing up and walking away toward the restroom. It showed my father turning his head to speak to Trey. And then, right in the center of the frame, it showed Vivian perfectly illuminated by the crystal chandeliers. "There," Aisha said, pointing to the screen. "Watch her hands." The officers watched in silence as the high-definition footage displayed Vivian opening her silver clutch. It showed her pulling out a small plastic baggie. It captured the exact moment she placed two large white pills on her coaster and crushed them with the heavy base of her water goblet. And it clearly, undeniably showed her sweeping the crushed white powder directly into my champagne flute before stirring it with her index finger. It was absolute, irrefutable proof. The video quality was so high you could practically read the brand name on her lipstick. Vivian let out a horrified whimpering sound. She covered her face with her hands, realizing that her final desperate lie had just cemented her path to a federal prison. As you can see, Aisha continued turning the iPad so the surrounding guests could witness the footage as well. The woman on the floor deliberately tampered with Miss Zora's beverage. When Miss Zora returned from the restroom, she simply swapped the glasses. The woman drank her own poison. The police officer let out a heavy sigh and shook his head. He pulled his handcuffs from his belt and looked down at Vivian with a mixture of pity and intense disgust. "Mom," the officer said, his voice hard and uncompromising. "Stand up. You are under arrest for aggravated assault, beverage tampering, and filing a false police report." "Wait," I interrupted, holding up a single finger. "Before you read her rights, I have one more piece of evidence for your report." I reached under the table and pulled out a heavy plastic evidence bag. Inside the clear sealed plastic was the original crystal champagne flute Vivian had drank from, complete with her ruby red lipstick mark on the rim. When I realized what she had done, I did not just let the waitstaff wash the dishes. I explained, handing the sealed bag to the second officer. I had my security team secure her original glass the moment it was cleared from the table. The remaining liquid and the powder residue at the bottom are perfectly preserved. You will not have to guess what she tried to give me. The lab will be able to match the chemical signature of the sedatives directly to the prescription bottles she keeps in her designer purse. The legal snare was drawn completely tight. There was no maneuvering out of high-definition video evidence and a preserved chain of physical custody. Vivian had spent 20 years trying to destroy my life with whispers and rumors, but I had just destroyed hers with hard, undeniable facts. The first officer grabbed Vivian by the arm and hauled her forcefully to her feet. She did not fight back. She did not scream. The sheer weight of her total defeat had finally crushed the last remaining ounce of her wicked arrogance. She hung her head, her ruined emerald gown dragging on the marble floor as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around her wrists. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. Vivian did not struggle. The sheer weight of her total defeat had completely drained the malicious energy from her body. Her shoulders slumped forward and her chin dropped to her chest. The heavy emerald silk gown that she had flaunted just an hour ago as a symbol of her wealth now looked like a tragic ruined costume dragging heavily across the imported marble floor. The first police officer gripped her by the arm and began marching her toward the heavy double doors at the back of the room. As she was paraded past the tables, the wealthy guests turned their bodies away from her. The politicians, the real estate developers, and the elite socialites she had spent 20 years desperately trying to impress refused to even look her in the eye. It was the ultimate social execution. She was officially a ghost in the world she had sacrificed her entire soul to conquer. As Vivian was led out into the flashing lights of the police cruisers, Harrison stepped forward. He smoothly intercepted the second police officer before the man could follow his partner outside. My corporate lawyer held up the crisp white folder containing the wire transfer receipts. Officer Harrison said, his voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a man who commanded federal courtrooms. "Before you leave, we have a secondary matter that requires your immediate attention. This folder contains legally subpoenaed banking documents proving that the woman standing over there systematically embezzled nearly $400,000 from a corporate account. We are pressing full federal charges for wire fraud and grand larceny. The officer took the white folder and flipped it open, scanning the top page. He looked up, locking his eyes directly on Lauren. Lauren practically jumped out of her skin. The velvet drapery she had been leaning against offered absolutely no protection. She looked around the room, her wide, terrified eyes searching for a way out, but there was nowhere to run. The officer walked purposefully toward her, resting his hand on his duty belt. "Ma'am," he said, his voice stern, "I am going to need you to come with me to the station for questioning regarding these financial transfers." Lauren began to hyperventilate for real this time. She looked at Trey, who was still kneeling on the wet carpet surrounded by the shattered glass of the floral arrangement. "Trey," she begged, her voice cracking with genuine panic. "Trey, please do not let them take me. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you authorized the transfers. Please, you are my husband." Trey did not even look up. He kept his face buried in his hands, completely ignoring the woman who had spent 5 years manipulating him into absolute poverty. He had finally realized that every word out of her mouth was a calculated lie. Lauren reached out toward my father, but Calvin turned his back to her, his face a mask of pure disgust. The officer reached her, grabbing her firmly by the elbow. "Let us go, ma'am," the officer instructed, steering her forcefully away from the wall. Lauren stumbled, her designer high heels clicking erratically against the marble. She was not crying anymore. She was just breathing in short, ragged gasps, staring blankly ahead as she was escorted out of the grand ballroom right behind my stepmother. The two architects of my father's destruction were finally being removed from the premises. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind them, leaving a profound, heavy silence in the room. The spectacular disaster was over. The villains had been hauled away. But the collateral damage was still sitting right in front of me. Trey slowly pulled his hands away from his face. He looked at the empty space where his wife had just been standing, and then he looked up at me. His custom tuxedo was soaked in water and champagne. His knees were stained from the carpet. The golden child, the arrogant heir who had spent his entire life looking down on me, was completely shattered. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, stumbling awkwardly as he found his footing. He took a hesitant step toward my chair. "Zora," he whispered, his voice raw and pathetic. "What am I supposed to do?" I looked at him without a single ounce of pity. "You are a 33-year-old man, Trey," I replied. "You figure it out." He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "You do not understand," he pleaded, taking another step closer. "I have nothing." Lauren drained my personal savings before she locked the accounts. The credit cards are maxed out. I do not even own the car I drove here tonight. I have never applied for a job in my life. Dad just handed me an office and a salary. I do not know how to write a resume. I do not know how to do anything, Zora. He dropped to his knees right beside my chair, his hands reaching out to grip the wooden armrest. He was begging. The brother who had mocked me for working hard, the brother who told me I was just a bitter, jealous woman, was now kneeling at my feet begging for survival. "Please, Zora," he sobbed. "You have millions. You own a private equity firm. Just give me a loan. Just $50,000 to help me get on my feet. Hire me at your company. Give me an executive position. I will do whatever you want. I am your brother." I stared down at him, completely unmoved by his tears. "You are not an executive, Trey," I stated coldly. "You do not have the discipline, the intelligence, or the work ethic to work at my firm. You would bankrupt my company in a week, just like you bankrupted Dad's." I looked up and caught the eye of Mr. Sterling, the country club manager, who was standing quietly near the edge of the ballroom. "Mr. Sterling!" I called out, my voice cutting through the quiet room. "Could you please bring a mop from the custodial closet?" Mr. Sterling nodded immediately. He turned and disappeared through a side door, returning less than a minute later, holding a heavy industrial mop with a wooden handle. He walked over to our table and stood respectfully waiting for my command. I looked back down at Trey. "I will not give you a loan, Trey," I said. "And I will certainly not give you an office. But I am a fair woman, and I do believe in the value of hard work. I gestured toward the massive puddle of spilled water, shattered crystal, and crushed white orchids covering the marble floor around our table. I reached over and took the wooden handle of the mop from Mr. Sterling. I dropped it directly in front of Trey's knees. The heavy, wet cotton head landed with a wet thud. The Oakmont Country Club is always looking for reliable custodial staff, I told him, my voice ringing with absolute finality. The starting pay is minimum wage. You get one 15-minute break every 4 hours, and you will be expected to scrub the toilets in the locker rooms before you clock out. You wanted a job. There is your equipment. You can start by cleaning up your mother's mess. Trey stared at the mop handle resting on the floor. He looked at the puddle of water, and then he looked out at the sea of wealthy elite guests who were watching him. The sheer humiliation of being offered a janitorial position in the very country club he used to strut through like royalty was completely paralyzing. He opened his mouth to protest, to demand the respect he felt he inherently deserved, but the words died in his throat. He had no leverage. He slowly bowed his head, his shoulders shaking as he reached out with a trembling hand and wrapped his fingers around the wooden handle of the mop. I turned my chair away from him, dismissing him entirely. My golden child brother was officially a janitor. There was only one person left to deal with. Calvin had been standing perfectly still, watching his son accept the ultimate degradation. He looked like a hollowed-out shell. He slowly walked around the table, dragging his feet, as if he was walking to his own execution. He stopped a few feet away from me, his hands clasped nervously in front of his ruined tuxedo. "Zora," he said, his voice shaking with a pathetic, desperate hope. "You were right. You were right about everything. I was a fool. I let my ego blind me to the truth. I let those women destroy our family." He took a deep breath, trying to compose his shattered dignity. "But that is all over now," he continued, forcing a weak, trembling smile. "Vivian is gone. Lauren is gone. It is just the two of us now, just father and daughter. We can rebuild our relationship. I know you own the company now, and I accept that. But please, Zora. I am an old man. I have a heart condition. I cannot start over from nothing. Let me stay in the house on Maple Drive. It was your mother's house. She would want me to be comfortable there. Let me stay, and I will stay out of your way." I looked at the man who had sold my mother's legacy to pay for his wife's luxury vacations. He was still trying to manipulate me. He was still trying to use my dead mother's memory as a shield to protect himself from the consequences of his own cowardice. He honestly believed that because we shared the same blood, I would simply forgive decades of emotional abuse and financial betrayal. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a single brass key threaded onto a cheap plastic ring. I tossed it onto the table. It slid across the dry linen and stopped right in front of him. "You are not staying on Maple Drive," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper. "I have already hired a contractor to rip out every single hideous decoration Vivian put in that house. I am restoring it exactly the way my mother built it, and you will never set foot on that property again." Calvin stared at the cheap brass key on the table. "Then what is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "That is the key to a modest one-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city," I replied. "I signed the lease yesterday. It has a small kitchen, a decent living room, and a window that faces a brick wall. I paid the rent for exactly 6 months in advance. You have electricity and running water." Calvin looked at me in absolute horror. "A one-bedroom apartment," he choked out the words, tasting like poison. "Zora, I am a multimillionaire. I am the former CEO of a real estate empire. I cannot live in a cheap apartment on the south side. My friends will see me. What will people say?" I stood up from my chair, my posture perfectly straight, projecting absolute dominance. "You are not a millionaire, Calvin," I corrected him coldly. "You are a bankrupt old man with $14 million in debt. Your friends are not your friends anymore. They watched your wife get arrested for poisoning me, and they watched your daughter-in-law expose your massive incompetence. Nobody in this room will ever take your phone calls again." I picked up my leather tote bag and slung it over my shoulder. "You have 6 months of paid rent," I told him, looking him dead in the eye. After that, you are entirely on your own. I suggest you learn how to budget your Social Security checks. Calvin reached out a shaking hand toward me. Zora, please. He begged, tears streaming down his face again. Do not do this. I am your father. I looked at his outstretched hand and felt absolutely nothing. You are not my father, Calvin, I said, my voice echoing with quiet, absolute finality. You are just a man who used to owe me a massive debt. And tonight I collected every single penny. I turned my back on him. I did not wait for his response. I did not look back at Trey, who was awkwardly dragging the heavy mop across the marble floor. I simply walked away. I moved through the grand ballroom, my head held high. The elite guests parted like the Red Sea, stepping out of my way with expressions of absolute awe and deep-seated respect. Nobody dared to speak to me. Nobody dared to offer a fake apology or a hollow compliment. They simply watched the new owner of the Oakmont Country Club walk through her domain. I pushed open the heavy glass doors leading out to the private terrace. The cold, crisp night air hit my face instantly, clearing away the suffocating smell of expensive perfume, spilled wine, and desperate fear that had choked the ballroom. The terrace was completely empty, overlooking the sprawling manicured lawns of the golf course. The sky was perfectly clear, dotted with thousands of bright silver stars shining down over the city. I walked over to the stone railing and rested my hands against the cool, polished granite. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the fresh air of total, absolute freedom. I had spent 35 years carrying the heavy, toxic weight of my family's expectations. I had survived the gaslighting, the emotional neglect, and the endless attempts to make me feel small. But tonight, I had finally cut the anchor. I had burned their fake empire to the ground and emerged from the ashes completely untouched. A soft footstep sounded behind me. I turned slightly and saw Aisha, the catering manager, stepping out onto the terrace. She was holding a silver tray with a single crystal flute resting in the center. The glass was filled with perfectly chilled, untouched vintage champagne. Congratulations, Miss Zora, Aisha said softly, offering a warm, genuine smile. On a very successful evening. I smiled back, a real, authentic smile that reached all the way to my eyes. Thank you, Aisha, I replied, taking the delicate crystal flute from the silver tray. And thank you for your incredible vigilance tonight. You will be seeing a very significant promotion on your next paycheck. Aisha bowed her head respectfully and stepped back into the ballroom, leaving me alone under the night sky. I turned back toward the sprawling estate, leaning against the stone railing. The grand ballroom behind me was a chaotic ruin of shattered glass, arrested criminals, and broken, arrogant men. But out here on the terrace, everything was peaceful and perfectly still. I raised the crystal champagne flute toward the stars, holding it high in the crisp night air. This one is for you, Mom, I whispered into the quiet darkness. We got the house back. I brought the glass to my lips and took a long, slow sip of the cold, clean champagne. It tasted like absolute victory. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that shared blood does not equal genuine loyalty, and family is never a free pass for abuse. For years, I believed that if I just stayed quiet and succeeded, I would eventually earn their respect. But toxic people do not respect boundaries. They only respect consequences. True freedom comes when you stop seeking validation from those who are committed to underestimating you. Walking away from a toxic environment is not an act of revenge, but an act of profound self-love. You are the sole author of your own worth. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace of mind? Share your experience.